So I'm excited we finally get to do this. So we have Luca Rigatti and Finn Morehouse.
God damn it, Vaden. 5 seconds in,
I know.
you're already butchering
I should have practiced the last name, but I definitely did not do that. So what's the origin of this conversation? We all are here to talk about long-termism and agree on some stuff, disagree on some other stuff. And how did this whole thing get started? Maybe we should start there.
Yeah, I think mostly it's because you haven't talked about long-termism yet. Yeah, what's the story? So you guys have raised some worries about this thing called long-termism. You wrote some things of your own, and you talked about it on the podcast. Luca and I happen to be interested in these questions as well, and I think we have some interesting differences to dig into. So feels worthwhile to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
You're here to prove us wrong in a couple sentences, in other words.
Yeah.
It'll be the shortest episode you've ever had.
Yeah.
And we should say you two are the charming hosts of the Hear This Idea podcast, which is a far more successful podcast than ours. So you guys are really lowering your standards, but we appreciate you guys coming on, and it should be fun, I think.
We're just giving back.
We're hoping we don't damage your reputation by having you on. Instead, hoping you help us raise our reputation. Right. We'll see how that happens. It could just be contagious.
So I guess we thought we would begin by all just maybe going around and talking about what the hell we're talking about, because I think it's going to be useful to ground this conversation. First, by just discussing what we all think about when we hear the term long-termism. I think it means different things to each one of us. And so perhaps that's a good place to start. And then hopefully the conversation will just explode into unstructured anarchy after that.
Okay, I'll try kicking off then. So what is long-termism? It has a history. It's not a new word. You see it come up in some corners of finance and business, and it means what you would expect it to mean. But the kind of long-termism we're interested in is more specific than that. And it's a kind of, so I would describe it as a family of moral views that have emerged in their kind of more precise forms in the last few years. They have a lot to do with the EA movement. Well, I think the comparison is to other exciting, interesting moral isms. Things like feminism or socialism, where it's just a bit silly to try to pin them down to anything specific, because those isms are just broad enough to encompass lots of different views, and sometimes those views actually just internally disagree. Because I think any interesting moral view isn't going to be the kind of thing you can pin down in a formal if and only if definition. And then that said, and we'll get into this, there are specific, jargon-filled definitions that you can give of different kinds of long-termism. And that's also true of other isms, right? You can be a very specific kind of socialist or feminist, especially if you're writing philosophy papers. It's really important that you kind of get clear about what you're talking about. So I'm sure we'll do that later. But I think, in general, long-termism is something it's a view that is especially concerned with how things go in the very long run. And by very long run, people tend to mean something like centuries or millennia. So we're not just talking the next few 2 or 3 political cycles. And attached to that, there's also a kind of empirical claim that society doesn't value the future as much as it should. And there are things we can do now to improve how the long run future goes. And then the kind of natural conclusion there is that we should do those things. So it's a kind of call to action as well. So that's the kind of the most general definition I would want to give. And that's kind of what I have in mind when I'm going to be talking about long-termism.
If I can add to that, I think from where I'm coming from, I think what Finn hit on there is really important, that there's not a clear definition of what long-termism is. And within isms, I guess it's still something that's very new, and something that within EA circles, we're still kind of trying to figure out what exactly it means. But the way that I kind of like to think about it is, out of this kind of EA perspective, is we're interested in doing the most good possible. And one really good thing that we've kind of found out in this mission of trying to do this is that it's worth really paying a lot of attention to the kind of stakeholders who tend to get ignored from the system. And the first kind of these stakeholders we found are like the poorest people in developing countries, because they just don't have a voice, right, when it comes to this global system. So helping them is like a really effective thing to do, because they're already so neglected and already it's such a bad point that it's a really effective way to do with your money. The next kind of stakeholder group you found is animals who don't have a voice for obvious reasons and are therefore suffering way more than they should. And now this kind of new idea that I think long-termism brings into is that future generations also don't have a voice, and they're really being neglected at the moment. And you can see this through things like climate change, I think most obviously. But even outside of this, there's loads of things like extinction risks or AI safety or other things I think we're going to get into that long-termism really points to and says this is actually really bad that we're ignoring this, and we're living in a really impatient society that is implicitly hurting these future people. And we should take this really seriously. And it can actually be the case that this is one of the most effective ways to help and to do good in the world, even if it's less easy to see than some of these other things. I think, yeah, when I'm going to refer to long-termism, that's kind of the viewpoint where I'm coming from.
So this is sort of the moral circle expansion viewpoint, where you've taken like moral progress that we've seen over time and sort of expanding spheres of concern that we've first given to, the poorest people and then to animals. And this is just sort of arguing that a natural extension of this would be towards people in time, which is captured by what did you call it, Finn, in your piece? The moral cylinder?
The moral cone.
The time cone.
Right?
Nice. Yeah, it's pretty good.
I'm proud of that.
Finn, do you want to explain why it's a cone?
Well, let's talk about the moral circle, which Ben mentioned, which is this image of the scope of the moral interests we take seriously. This is originally Peter Singer talking about it. His idea is that circle, very roughly speaking, has expanded over time. And there's also a kind of normative claim there, which is that it should expand. That's a good thing, to take seriously the interests of more and more moral stakeholders. And one in to long-termism is to think that long-termism is just kind of extending that circle even more. But a kind of like silly but I guess fun way of doing it is to think about the circle extending over another dimension into time, and that would be a cylinder. And then you think about that again and you think, well, one thing that not just long-termists like to emphasize, but one thing that just seems pretty clear is that the future could be more valuable than the present in terms of just its size and also the kind of things that go on in it. So would it be a cylinder, or could it be like a cone? Yeah, I don't think it's like a very serious analogy, but it's kind of fun to think about.
Excellent. Yeah, so perhaps I can explain why I'm so worried about this as a way to start kindling some fun disagreement. So yeah, like I think every time I've talked about this on the podcast, without fail, I always start by saying that like I love EA, and I'm not going to break tradition because I love EA a lot. Particularly because of like all of the like super important work that it's doing and say like fighting global poverty, like you had mentioned, the Against Malaria Foundation, or deworming charities, or like unconditional cash transfers and animal welfare. Like these are super important issues, which EA has not only talked about but actually done something about, and so it's super impressive. But like to any listeners out there, if they care about these issues, then I think that they should be incredibly worried about long-termism, because I think long-termism swallows all of it. It's this argument that demolishes every other form of charitable giving, and it kind of works like this. So all the arguments from within the space of long-termism roughly take this form. First, you start with some dystopian, nightmarish sci-fi scenario. So for example, like Black Mirror, the one where John Hamm imprisons people in like an Alexa for like 1,000 years. Let's take that as an example. And then you say, listen, I know that this is unrealistic, and I know that there's like an infinitesimally small probability of this scenario happening. But if it did, the expected amount of suffering it would cause would be infinite. And so you start with some like tiny probability of some crazy scenario happening, like 10 to the negative 10. And then you multiply it by the utility of it not happening or the disutility of it happening. That's like 10 to the 500. And then you say, oh my God, in expectation, the most important thing we could be doing right now is preventing John Hamm from imprisoning us in an Alexa. And like, lest our listeners think I'm making this up, this is actually on the 80,000 Hours website. So I would recommend anyone who thinks I'm like being a little bit silly here to go.
John Hamm is on the 80,000 Hours website.
Yeah. So if you go to,
or a link from there, if you go to S risks,
exactly. So this is called an S risk, and if you go to the May 2020 article titled "Our Current List of Especially Pressing World Problems," on the top of the list are things like coming up with governance strategies for outer space, whole brain emulation, and this thing called S risk. And if you click on S risk, the see more link, it takes you to a post which starts as a illustrative example with John Hamm in Black Mirror. And then it says, this actually isn't an S risk because S risks are worse. This is like the low end. And then if you go further down on the link, like I wish I was making this up. Lowest priorities, according to 80,000 Hours, are things like mental health research, biomedical research, and other basic science, and increasing access to pain relief in developing countries. So what is happening is that sci-fi scenarios are taking precedence over literally reducing the amount of pain and suffering for people alive right now in Africa. And this is something that they are proud of. So when I say I'm worried about long-termism, specifically what I'm referring to is arguments of those form. Dystopian sci-fi scenario multiplied by tiny probability of it happening, multiplied by a large expected value if it did happen. Because this style of argumentation can swallow everything that you both listed as being important and the stuff that people talk about on your podcasts all the time. So if you care about animal welfare, if you care about the poor, as I do, then you should be very worried about the popularity of this kind of argumentation. And so this is why I'm so worried about it. And like, this is why I'm really excited to talk with both of you, because it is starting to devour 80,000 Hours, and it's going to continue to move charity by charity, just striking them off the list until we are all just thinking about Black Mirror. So that's my concern.
Like, I definitely agree, actually, like with a lot of what you say. And I think like one important thing to note as well is that like I'm by no means have like a firm opinion. I think it's a super important thing that you two have brought up, and like congrats as well on like engaging that conversation and replying to like the tons of comments you guys got. Like I'm sure that took a lot of effort and stuff. But I think it's a valuable point you raise.
There are presumably some people who are really bought into long-termism and have decided that the most impactful thing to do right now is to go through and downvote every single thing Ben Chug has posted on the EA forum. It seems like that anyway. So well done for sticking around and starting this conversation. I agree, it's a worthwhile one to have, either side you're on. One thing I want to ask, Vaden, on that point you bring about there, and this is like something I'm not sure about myself though, is let's say that for whatever reason, we take this, we need to stop John Hamm's scenario as like the most important priority thing. Like, what do you see the actions to actually stopping that being? And like, how would that lead to this kind of negative world? I think one of the issues that I have is, and I'm not sure about this, but like, even if you think about these kind of long-term goals that might feel really abstract and wrong, like what like tangible actions would that cause that you would feel is, helpful to the world, or is it mostly like an opportunity cost kind of thing for you?
Fund reallocation. So you can imagine, look at the 80,000 Hours list of priorities, and then flash that against, say, the list of priorities on GiveWell or on the Open Philanthropy, and just look at what they prioritize, which is, say, poverty alleviation and fighting disease and suffering for people alive right now. And just imagine every single one of those just gets replaced with Black Mirror episode 1, Black Mirror episode 2, Black Mirror episode 3. And we're talking, hundreds of millions of dollars that flow through EA. And the concrete harm is simply that this, I like the comparison to feminism. that Finn, that you raised, because you view this as like second wave EA, and second wave EA is.
What are you saying about second wave?
No, I'm a huge fan of second wave feminism, of course. But this idea of movements coming in waves is the thing which I'm highlighting. And huge fan of second wave feminism, obviously. Less of a fan of third wave feminism. And you can see the clash between a lot of the views held by third wave feminists as trying to undo a lot of the progress made by second wave feminists. Not to get into that conversation too much, but that is,
full guys debate.
I think that is kind of what's happening right here with long-termism. There's this new wave, which is undoing everything which McCaskill had built in the first wave. Because, like you said, if we expand our moral circle, now we are weighing the well-being of people who are alive and suffering right now against the well-being of an infinite number of people in the future. And because this style of argumentation is taken so seriously within this community, nothing will survive it. Everything is going to get taken over by this. And so the worry that I have is precisely the opposite love that I had for EA in the first place. I'm worried about losing all the things that EA has built.
Luca, can I understand your question as asking something slightly more subtle, which is, even if the goals that long-termism aspires to, or like the objectives, so reducing some crazy sci-fi scenario suffering, it could be the case that in trying to meet this objective, the actual day-to-day operations that you would do so would be good, or would be the same as some other objective, like just trying to make the world happier and healthier, for example.
Yeah, like I think a good way to kind of distinguish from this is, and I think is kind of something you said in like one of your previous podcast episodes, there is like a scenario, right, where you take strong long-termism so seriously that you're just willing to cause any amount of harm, for the next 1,000 years, in the hope that that will create some even larger astronomical value in the future, right? And then because time goes on, in 1,000 years' time, you're willing to make the exact same trade-off, and that just causes us like in a really bad spiral thing. And I think that's like one thing that's like interesting, but I feel that's like very different to the argument of long-termism is just useless and these things are never going to materialize and it's just funding research that no one's going to read, and it's kind of like getting rid of that money, right? It's kind of, you might as well have burnt it and stuff. And that just feels like two qualitatively different arguments that we can both have, right? But that was just what I was kind of interested in where Vaden stands on this. If you see this like long-termism in of itself, all right, ironically enough, like as an S risk, where we become so obsessed with this thing that we kind of bring dystopia amongst ourselves, as opposed to this is just like silly guys. Yeah, I was just kind of curious where you stand on that.
Definitely the latter. Yeah. Sorry, the former. I think that it is not just silly academics writing publications that no one's going to read. I think it is a philosophy that's turning into an ideology, frankly. And I think that if it was relegated to obscure academic journals, then I wouldn't really care. But the fact that it is starting to take over things that I do care about is why I think that, yes, it is like an S risk in and of itself. Yeah, definitely.
So I think it would be useful here just to draw a distinction to make sure we're not running together too many things. Yeah, so Vaden, I take it you are reacting in everything you've said so far to what gets called strong long-termism, which does what it says on the tin. It's the most kind of radical working out of this kind of view. What are we distinguishing that from? Well, I think there is a more expansive and more accommodating kind of long-termism, which doesn't make these kind of absolute claims which you take it to be making. It's not saying let's go and steal money in like significant amounts from these other cause areas. What it is saying is, look, at the margin, we found this thing that seems to matter a great deal, and crucially, almost no one is making a targeted effort in this area. So that gives a case for like moving money right now into kind of exploring what we can do with respect to long-termism. But there's no claim there about like the absolute amounts. And that feels more sympathetic to me. And what I want to kind of highlight is this worry that you respond to the most extreme things people have said and then take that to stand for what everyone is saying under the guise of long-termism. I'll just read out like the strong long-termism definition from the paper. So they do manage to complicate things. They have two versions. They have an axiological and a deontic version, which I think is jargony and not hugely relevant. So the axiological version is just a claim about what is best to do. So axiology is just like talking about what things are good or bad. And here it is. They say, in a wide class of decision situations, the option that is ex ante best is contained in a fairly small subset of options whose ex ante effects on the very long run future are best. That's actually impressively vague, even for like their attempt at making the most like precise definition, and that's deliberate. But what it does say is that, well, the example they give is like someone is thinking where to donate like a bunch of money, and they want to do the most good possible, and they are saying right there the best thing to do would be to give it to some long-termist cause, which is going to look very different from the kind of traditional EA cause areas. So that's like a bold claim. And yeah, just to underline what I'm trying to like flag here is that you don't have to buy into that strong claim in order to be a long-termist. You might just think, hey, look, we found this thing called long-termism. It's really underrated right now. So well done us. Let's also care about this in addition to all these other things. And let's not worry about the absolute kind of proportion of efforts right now, because frankly, we don't need to.
May I ask, do you buy into the strong long-termist claim? And why or why not?
I'm agnostic because it's like...
Call out. Just kidding.
Can I give a more interesting answer than that?
My hunch is that you find something deeply wrong with that claim, and hence your agnosticism. And I'm trying to tease it out because I think we'll have common ground when you explain or explore that.
Here's what I find most worrying, and what I think you are both absolutely right to raise. This is pretty much the first like serious shot at writing a piece of academic philosophy that is grappling with long-termism directly, or at least it's one of the very first few. Now, one of the broader aims for people who are bought into long-termism is to make this more than just a kind of niche, wonky philosophical position. The goal is to make it, like a vibrant movement that encompasses like non-academics. And, the comparison goes back to other isms like feminism, where you don't have to read like analytic philosophy about feminism in order to call yourself a feminist. Now, if that's the goal, what is the best way of doing that? Probably not writing this like really controversial, really easy to misunderstand piece as like the first kind of public facing thinking about it. I don't want to like guess the reasons why Will and Hillary wrote it, but I don't think it's too unclear. Like that's the game you play in academia and certainly in philosophy, is you try writing about the most kind of extreme claims or the most out there claims that you can defend in good faith, and that's how you generate criticism, you get buzz and you get citations. And when you're not like potentially at the start of a significant moral movement, then that's like fair game. But where you are, it's just like such an unforced error. So that's a worry, but that doesn't really answer your question, because the question was, is it actually true? That's going to be, like part of the conversation is trying to figure it out. I think one thing to say is that it's appropriate and actually probably right to be uncertain about these things, to be like morally uncertain in general. That's like not a shameful place to be at all. I'm no place to say anything especially kind of authoritative, right? But it seems like it could be true and maybe isn't.
The way that I kind of like look at it, and this kind of like flips the table to you guys, but like when you hear about like the like very simple argument that future generations matter, at least to some degree. And it's probably likely that at the moment we're taking that far less seriously than we should be. And that probably has some conclusions for what EA should be doing and what we should be prioritizing. That feels really strong. And I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that, or like how deeply you disagree with that statement. And I definitely don't have like any background in philosophy, so I'm completely clueless as to that. But that makes like a lot of intuitive sense to me. And when I think about it like on the margin, I don't think it's bad having people talking and exploring this idea, even if it's kind of just nudging the needle to something that's more sensible. I think it is important at some points to just think that EA is just in of itself still a very small community. You know, when you look at the whole globe, and things like GiveWell have really taken off. Like I know lots of people who have heard about GiveWell and have never heard about effective altruism and haven't heard about long-termism.
Thank you, very bad wizards.
Yeah, right. And like, I think it is kind of amazing if you give EA some credit as well for that in like promoting these things. I think that's really awesome. But then that kind of makes you think, okay, well, what is EA's job then? I don't think after, they reach some critical mass, I think EA's job is to look at the next thing to kind of explore and to promote. And I think long-termism just isn't really taken seriously at all, just because it is such a new idea that I don't think it's bad having people explore that, even if, we're not quite at something that has like a great conclusion yet, or has something like super reliable, as to like what kind of actions we take from it. I do think it's still important.
Nice. Yeah. So I think I agree with the point you're just making, but part of exploring a new idea is taking it to its extremes and then getting pushback, right? Which is exactly, I think, what we're trying to do is like criticize the idea. I'd also just like to make a point with the strong long-termism, because my reading of it is slightly different. My reading of the strong long-termism paper is that it's an inevitable conclusion from taking the ideas of long-termism seriously. So Vaden made, I think, what is an apt analogy with religion in the last episode, which I'm just going to ruthlessly paraphrase, which is, say you have this idea that there like might be an omniscient God in the sky. Then if you actually follow the logic of that, you get somewhere like fundamentalism. So you once you adopt certain premises, you end up at certain conclusions. And I think that's exactly what's going on in the case of long-termism. So as soon as you allow sort of this expected value reasoning to like sneak in the door, every conversation, all your reasoning is now going to be swamped by the potential vastness of the future, and you have to end up at something like long-termism, because once you adopt this kind of reasoning, now you're weighing finite well-being in the present against potentially infinite or near infinite well-being in the future. And
what does near infinite mean?
Yeah, exceptionally large.
Google Docs.
Yeah, although that's an important difference. And just to like briefly react to that, I think it's worth pointing out that neither Will nor Hillary ever claim that they're like fully sold. They're kind of raising this as an interesting and plausible idea. And the reason they don't do that is because it's possible to be uncertain about something even when the argument looks plausible on the face of it. Where does that uncertainty come in? Well, it can come in at the kind of normative level, where like you've raised this problem with using the expected value framework in certain contexts. You think it breaks down, and that feels like something worth worrying about. And the uncertainty can also enter in the empirical questions, because the strong long-termist conclusion only pops out once you actually consider how the world is. You need to be sure that there are things we can actually do to reliably influence how the long-run future goes. And that's another place where you might just think there are no ways we can improve the long-run future. And I think the state of play now, it's fair to say, is that maybe with the exception of certain kinds of existential risk, how we might possibly like reliably influence how things go like 1,000 years from now, who knows? So I think it's appropriate to be uncertain, even if you are like half sympathetic towards this.
To respond to something that Luca had asked, what do we think about the argument that people in the long-term future, their voices aren't represented and we need to do something now to help, right? I think that's a totally reasonable argument. And I could imagine a variation of long-termism, which says we care about the long-term future, but we also recognize we cannot make these sci-fi arguments because they're destructive. You can have both of these thoughts in your head simultaneously, and that could lead you to certain conclusions. Like, for example, we need to work on, say, reducing the likelihood of nuclear war, but we're not going to take this out of our budget that helps poverty alleviation, because one thing that we know is that the only reason that we are here doing as well as we're doing in the 21st century is because previous generations had worked quite hard to improve the world in an incremental way to pass it on to their the following generation. And so most of the arguments that start the conversation around long-termism about wanting to ensure the long-run future goes well, I'm totally in favor of it. It's just that they funnel in, to use your cone analogy, they funnel into these, and we need to work on S risks. And so that's the only thing that I'm saying should not be done, because so on the infinite or very large point, the reason why the word infinite is useful is because for any big number that you give, I can give a bigger number. There's no end to this game. There's no final number which we can all agree is the biggest. And so whatever move you make to try to encourage me to work on X risks, I can play the same move back and say, well, we should work on S risks, which is exactly what was happening. So my main point of criticism is in this style of argument. And I think it's possible to excise that style of argument from the conversation of long-termism and not make it this zero-sum, either long-term future or short-term future, and raise additional money to, say, prevent bioterrorism and nuclear weapons. I'm totally in favor of all of that. Of course, that's great. And AI safety as well, of course. But we shouldn't take it out of the budget to help the poor, or help people who are alive right now. And that's the thing that I'm highlighting. Yeah.
This feels like progress to me. So something Luca mentioned earlier is that buying into the whole expected value Bayesian framework is neither necessary and actually nor sufficient to get long-termism. And there is a version of long-termism which just seems uncontroversially good, and that's the version you just talked about, Vaden. Like, you don't need lots of massive numbers and calculations. You just need to appreciate that the future could potentially be very large and full of really great, valuable things. And you need to recognize that, like, the world just does nothing, or like next to nothing. You know, you hear the statistics like the Biological Weapons Convention, which is this kind of UN body for enforcing prohibitions on certain kinds of experimentation with bioweapons. It has the funding of like an average McDonald's. So at the margin, let's just like do a little bit more. And that seems right. That also seems like it deserves to be called long-termism. And if that is true, then am I hearing that you at least think that a kind of semi-skimmed version of long-termism is fine?
We've always said that. I think we say this repeatedly, that there's nothing wrong with wanting to protect the future. We just have to realize that we're comparing the suffering of people who don't yet exist to people, say, in Nigeria or in Botswana, it's an illegitimate move. We can't do that. But there's nothing wrong with wanting to solve problems today precisely because we care about our descendants. And I disagree slightly that the world doesn't care about the long-term future. It does. It just doesn't use this word. What do you think, like, the founding fathers were thinking about when they set up the United States Constitution? They're considering, how do we best ensure that a whole bunch of people can live harmoniously together in the long term?
I phrased that pretty bad.
But I'd say on that, like, Vaden, I agree what you're saying, and I do think people care about the future, but people also care, right, about like people in Africa as well, right? We send 0.8% of GDP like as foreign aid, but that doesn't mean that's enough, right? Okay. I think the point of long-termism is that we might care some amount about future generations, but we're not caring enough. And that means more resources need to go to those cause areas. And I think it is like, it's something we definitely need to be aware of, is that those resources are going to come from somewhere, right? Mm. And it is a very tough question to ask. And I think it's also something that EA generally is, I mean, this is like a generalization, but like, I think it is something that people in EA should think about more, is that when you are spending money on anything, that is also money that's coming from somewhere. And, but like even so, I think that the point of long-termism is that it's not enough, that we should be spending more resources, and those are going to come from somewhere. And then I guess the question that you're worried about is that it comes at the harm of really important short-term interventions.
Yeah, what What would enough look like, and how would you know when you're there?
Yeah, I've got no clue.
Because it will always be more, right? That's my main point. It'll always just be more and more and more, because there is no way to know what is a billion years from now is going to look like. There's a wall of not uncertainty. I hate the use of this word uncertainty, because uncertainty and knowledge are different things. But there's a wall of unknowability that we cannot puncture through, right? And so there's a huge asymmetry in what we can know about, say, reducing incidence of malaria via bed net distribution, and reducing incidence of being locked in John Hamm's Alexa via what? Like, if this wasn't such a real example, it would be ludicrous, but it's prioritized more highly than increasing access to pain relief in developing countries on 80,000 hours. And so on the strong long-termism point, like, I just want to read a quote from 80,000 hours website, so they give a list of 6 things, which is at the very tail end of their list of priorities. So the 6 things are the following: mental health research, biomedical research and other basic science, increasing access to pain relief in developing countries, other risks from climate change. So climate change has now slipped away from long-termist cause to something that they don't prioritize as much. Reducing smoking in developing countries. These are 5 things which they say we don't prioritize as highly because they seem less likely to substantially impact the very long run future. So I'm not the one making this equivalence. This is what is already happening. And it's happening at the expense of human beings' lives. And it's because there is always going to be a call for more, because of the infinite value of the future, which one can always fall back on. So if we can excise this style of argumentation from the long-termist discussion and prevent important causes like preventing pain in developing countries, for Christ's sake, if we can prevent important causes from being just devoured by this style, then I'm completely fine with long-termism. But from what I can tell, long-termism is based on arguments from Nick Bostrom that are just all about this stuff. And if we can come to a place where long-termism doesn't represent this kind of argument, I'm happy. And we can think and talk about the future for as long as we want. We can talk about the resources that should be allocated there, as long as we just disallow this kind of reasoning.
Yeah. No, okay. If I can try and pick up on 2 points there. One is, I agree that I'm super skeptical that we have any idea what's going to happen, even in 100 years. I'm personally super skeptical of that, and super skeptical of any claims that rely on that. I think if you just look at what the world was 100 or 200 years ago, and you put yourself in those shoes and you try to predict in any way what's going to happen, I think that should just be really humbling. Just to say, I'm with you on that. And for me, most long-termist causes that I believe in don't rely on that argument, right? You can make a case for building rigorous institutional design or fighting against corruption and those other more broad terms that are justified by long-termism because they might come useful at some point, even without being specific, right, of what happens in 100 or 200 years' time. The other point, and I think this is an important thing to kind of get into and might be a bit more where we tangibly disagree on things, is that I don't think equating future utility and current utility with zero discount means that there's an infinite amount of value in the future. So the way that I kind of come from this is with a little bit of the economics kind of take on this. And there you have something called social time preferences, which kind of are composed of 3 variables. So the first one is just the pure time preference, so to speak, which is what we're kind of talking about with, okay, in the very abstract sense, is one life in the future worth one life today? But then there's also other things you need to consider, right? Which is that generally we've seen the future getting richer, and that should count for something, right? If we like to hope that things are going to get better, then surely there is a case to say that, okay, people are going to be much poorer today than in the future. So isn't there a case to help people more today? And then the other thing is a more wonky thing called inequality aversion. But basically what you get with this kind of growth rate to think about, and that's just one thing that econs kind of like to focus on. You can bring in other things like uncertainty and stuff, is that you can still make the case that future lives are worth just as much, but because of some external factors or assumptions, you can still get your practical discount rate to decrease in a way that it doesn't go to infinity, right? And governments have to make these decisions all the time. Every time the government thinks about whether they should build a nuclear power plant, which will have effects for 100 years, or when they're debating about climate change and the social cost of carbon, they're already like making these assumptions and they're talking about these things. And you don't get this like infinity problem, right? Governments are still able to come up with some decisions. You might criticize with those decisions and you might disagree with what things they kind of use, but you can still have a zero time preference and not assume there's like this infinity of value in the future that you're willing to make any sacrifices for. And I think that in some way makes me like a bit more confident about like taking a more extreme long-termist position and not have to worry about this thing you kind of described.
Before jumping into the time preference issue, can I just pick up on your first point, Luca, which is you said that long-termism enables us to justify certain interventions like more robust institutional design and working on democracy or something. But I'm wondering if either of you have an example of a problem that is worked on only under the guise, can only be worked on and justified by long-termist reasoning that can't be justified by other sorts of moral reasoning that is not sort of a sci-fi scenario. So Finn, I completely agree with you that like long-termism is this family of views, right? But the way I'm viewing it right now is like it's a family of views all based on certain styles of reasoning. And the conclusions, the valid conclusions that you get from this, like improving institutional decision making or decreasing nuclear armament, these are all problems that can be worked on under the guise of like basically any other problem solving mentality ever. And then it's only sort of the ludicrous scenarios that you get because of the long-termism. And I think these are actually, once you start taking the reasoning very seriously, like I said before, sort of inevitable. And so that's the problem I have with it. Not necessarily that exactly what it's justifying right now, but, the kinds of reasonings that can undergird a lot of these.
The answer
causes.
is changing the QWERTY keyboard layout to make it more sensible so that our descendants can enjoy it. Right. And the serious answer is name an intervention that can only be justified with effective altruist reasoning in general, and that isn't just obviously good before. Clearly, unconditional cash transfers to the extreme poor or handing out insecticide-treated bed nets is like an obviously good thing. So I would struggle to think of something to answer that question, even in this kind of general EA case.
I wouldn't struggle at all. The deworming, like this is how McCaskill cut his teeth, right? Is that you can't just give to charities that make you feel good. You have to look at the data. This is like to your point of like what could you justify with EA reasoning that you couldn't justify with other reasoning. Everything that EA does is all about the data, and this is why they were so powerful and important.
I think effective altruism is also a family of views, and it is home to an awful lot of ideas. So it's difficult to say anything too sweeping about it.
That's right.
But one of the interesting things it does is tells you which interventions and cause areas to prioritize and what to do about that, rather than coming up with entirely new interventions, although it does do that occasionally. And I think something similar is going on in the case of long-termism. So the criticism that you raise is that, look, it's either trivial in that we already knew these things matter, like clearly we don't want nuclear war, so it'd be good to reduce that risk, or it's just false or like dangerous. If you're using the kind of expected value framework and you get these infinities and you start worrying about John Hamm taking over the world. And I think there is some course to be steered between triviality and ridiculous falsehood, where long-termism is saying something substantial and interesting, not in terms of coming up with entirely new interventions, although maybe there are some, but in terms of getting a better grip on what kind of things we should be prioritizing now. And look, maybe one of these examples is like funding that biological weapons convention as a start.
Yeah, I think Finn hit it on the head there, where like deworming happened, right, before the EA community existed. It's not something new. And I think there's like a bit of conflation going on between like causes and choices, right? Everybody can care about a cause. You can, as we said before, everybody cares about the future to some degree. Everybody cares about, people in developing countries to some degree and animals to some degree. But the question is like, how much weight do you put on these things and how does that affect your choices? And in the same way that the choice that EA highlighted when it came to deworming is, do you spend on a very inefficient charity at home, or do you spend on a very efficient evidence-based charity abroad? And there's a much stronger case for making that through that EA reasoning. I think what long-termism is it takes a different choice, which is the question of, do we spend money today or do we invest in the future? And there the case then is, there are like very strong reasons to believe that you should be investing it. But it's that choice, right? That's the difference.
Yeah, one thing to say here is that one can be critical of long-termism, but still support some of the interventions that it brings about. So again, like I think a good parallel here is religiosity, because one can be supportive of, for example, the idea of like tithing in religious circles, and so like giving 10% of your income to charity, for example. So one can think that that's a really good idea, but think that the reason that the religious cite to do so are really bad ideas. So like this idea that there's like an almighty creator in the sky who's going to punish you if you don't tithe is a bad reason to tithe, even though tithing itself might have positive consequences and be a good idea. And so it's just worth separating like the criticism of the style of reasoning that long-termism usually use from what they're actually doing day to day.
That's a really good example. So just like a really brief thing to say is like, you get a similar thing, right? With long-termism as well, where you have this like idea of keeping the world, well, I think it's called like the 7 generations of sustainability. I think that's like an idea from like, a Native American tribe. And, you know, that I doubt they were like thinking about things in expected utility or this kind of utilitarian framework, but they still kind of reached that same conclusion, of taking future generations much more seriously. I think that's a really good example, Ben.
I was just going to highlight a difference between the kinds of arguments that McCaskill and EA were making when arguing for, say, deworming programs over play pumps. That style of reasoning is scientific. It's one that says we have our assumptions about the world, and then we have data, and we're going to collect data to challenge our assumptions because we could be wrong. And that was why it was such a powerful argument in favor of reallocation, right? But there is no such argument that is possible to be made about the future 1 billion years from now. There's no real way to get any sort of data whatsoever. And I'm okay with some, like, I think at one point in the EA forum, I highlighted just that there is a methodological error being made equating expected values of the future and expected values of malaria bed nets, because in one scenario you have data and in another scenario you don't. And I would be entirely okay with, say, people arguing about fund reallocation within the realm of long-termism. So do we want to put more money towards S risks or towards preventing a global totalitarian government regime from enslaving us all, or to AI? Fine. We can say in this domain, we do not have data, and so we can talk about portfolio reallocation within that domain, but we cannot cross compare because we're not comparing apples to apples. And so for short-term interventions where we have data, we can talk about reallocation in that domain as well. But it's this cross-contamination of expected value reasoning that allows people to say it's much more important to work to prevent John Hamm than it is to work to prevent people dying from malaria all day. And this is because of faulty reasoning. And that's why both Ben and I are highlighting this is a problem. But if people just return to the way, like what we all learned from McCaskill in the first place, reading his brilliant book about the importance of data. If we return to that and then add to it some concern for the long-term future, fully recognizing the limitations of our tools here, then I'm okay with it. Of course, we can talk about a lot of this stuff, but we just have to be super careful not to let it distract from poverty alleviation and helping people who are suffering right now. Yeah.
Let's plant a flag here, right? So it sounds like we've reached a kind of agreement that the things long-termists care about, the kind of sensible things like reducing the risk of all-out nuclear war or bioweapons or something like this, these are sensible. And to the extent that long-termism is going to make those changes more likely to happen, then more power to it. What you guys are worried about, Ben and Vaden, is the kind of reasoning or the most popular kind of reasoning that leads to those conclusions. And especially when you get so hung up on this kind of inappropriate use of what is just like a formal tool, that you start actually taking seriously the kind of ridiculous extreme things it says when you like really push that style of reasoning. And that's what you're worried about, especially when that style of reasoning becomes parasitic on the part of EA that was so important during its kind of earlier period, which is this emphasis on actual empirical data, because you can't reason in the absence of
a beautiful synthesis of our views, or at least my view. Excellent job. That was great. I completely sign off on all of that. Beautifully said. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about that.
And here's why you're wrong.
Yeah. Right.
Can I maybe pick up on one thing, just because it linked to like Vaden's example of deworming, which I think might be like a nice segue-ish into this debate about using evidence and stuff. And a lot of what you said, I'm very sympathetic with. I think one important thing to note is that when we're talking about evidence and certainty and stuff, and a lot of the criticisms, rightful criticisms, I think you raised about expected utility and like low probabilities and stuff, is a more general critique that's not just relevant to long-termism. So you gave the example of deworming, right? Deworming is like very famous in development economics for actually being like a very hotly debated study thing. I think in Givewell's own methodology, right, they discount the effect of worming by 98 to like 99% just because of uncertainty about like how relevant the results are. So I guess like in more particular, there was basically a study that showed that deworming was really good in this like one very specific circumstances, but a lot of very clever people have raised a lot of concerns about like if that like is actually externally valid to other situations as well, which had to do with a flooding and some other things where basically people earned a lot of money, but there wasn't really clear like why they did. And there is like a big, it's a whole like tangent to go down to. But like basically the point being that even with these short-term interventions, you can be really uncertain about if they actually work. But Givewell also uses expected value calculus, right, to reach these decisions that have very low probabilities. I mean, deworming is like a very novel example here, but I think is a point to raise that this is like a more general critique. I think of like using evidence and reasoning than just like long-termism, even though like long-termism might be the most extreme example.
But notice the ability in that very example for Givewell to be refuted, right? So there's a process by which people can go collect more data and refute the reasoning Givewell uses, right? This is how academia works. We publish papers, and individual papers not to be taken as God's word on the topic, right? And so more academics go out and do more studies, and over time we start getting a clearer picture. And there was one study in it, and then we course correct, and we're continually guessing at what the world looks like and continually refuting the worst ideas and getting closer and closer to the truth, right? And the mechanism to do this in the Givewell case is continually going back to the data, looking at it more scrupulously, going out and getting more data, asking more questions, criticizing the framework, the assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. The ability to do this in the long-termist case is very, very limited, right? So you can only criticize basically the use of expected value calculus, but there's very few ways in which you can. Once you adopt that style of reasoning, it's very difficult to start refuting some of the conclusions, because like, are we just going to wait 100,000 years and see how many future humans there were and then say, oh shit, we were wrong about that one, and so I just want to highlight the differences in the ability to actually correct our errors, which is, I think, crucial.
Right. Yeah, that's a very valid point.
There's a few things to say here, right? One is, in life, occasionally you are forced to make decisions where there is no possibility of gathering evidence before the fact. There's no possibility of, correcting course and falsifying your guesses, but not making a call and not doing anything about whatever the situation you face is constitutes a decision as well. And I'm not suggesting you're saying this, but a claim to the effect that we should only ever do things when it's possible to gather like good empirical evidence about whether this is a good thing to do, that's not gonna work. And sometimes you have to rely on other things like arguments and reasons as well as data. So maybe that's the first thing to say there.
This is the reason why I tried to frame it as a methodological error that could be rectified. It's about this cross comparison thing. I recognize that, working to start thinking about what governance structures will have to be on Mars when we populate Mars is a useful conversation. I'm in favor of that for sure. I'm not saying that one can only think about that which we have immediate data. That would be self-refuting, because I'm super interested in philosophy, and in philosophy you typically don't have data to adjudicate. So totally. Again, it's not about saying we cannot think about the long-term future. I'm all in favor of science fiction just as a form of expression and of idea generation. It's just we can't then compare to situations where we have data, because these are very different phenomena. And especially we can't compare using the same word like probability, because the word probability means very different things to different people, but they don't realize that. They don't realize that when you talk about Toby Orr's probability, he's just talking about a made-up number. And when you talk about the probability associated with bed nets, or take maybe a clearer example, the probability associated with AI takeover compared to the probability associated with a volcanic eruption. One comes from frequencies, which you can count, and the other comes from just belief states, which we all know are completely subject to bias of various different forms. So agree that we can't just exclude all forms of reasoning without data. It's just we have to be careful about this cross comparison.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. I think one thing to maybe add there as well is that, right, when we're talking about, I guess, like what we have evidence and stuff on, we also need to be aware, even in like those interventions like deworming or other things, about like some of the long-term effects that it might have, right? Because at the moment we're kind of very implicitly assuming that the RCT result is what we get and like nothing happens thereafter, right? But there are also, you can imagine a scenario, right, where like in 50 or 60 years, that kind of has knock-on effects, or like I don't know, it might have positive long-term effects that we're not aware of and we're not factoring in, and actually giving malaria nets and deworming is even more valuable because it boosts GDP in some way, or it lets well, I forget like the name for it, but like this Einstein example, right, where you just have to think about like all these smart people who have ever lived in the world who just died of malaria and they were never given the chance, right, to contribute to. I think these are also things that just feel really hard to quantify and like have evidence for in any way, but still feel like they should inform our decision making, right, to some degree.
Was that a long-termist case for short-term intervention?
Yeah, well, I don't know, kind of exploring it, right? But yeah. I think there is like a case to be made there, to just like really consider the long-term effects as well.
Yeah, I want to take a second to just echo Vaden's point, which is a point that I think I regret not making in our last two episodes about long-termism, which I think I think the position I'm espousing is easily conflated with empiricism, which I think, Finn, you were rightly pointing out, which is to say we can't only act when we have data. And I completely agree. So, and this is where like the role of a good theory and a good explanation comes in science, right? So we have to act in accordance with like the best theory of something. So we had good reason to adopt like relativity, for example, which predicted black holes, and therefore I think we should act in accordance that the universe like has black holes before we like gather data about it. And this has been super prevalent actually in the COVID case, which someone like Rob Wiblin has been very good at pointing out, which is like the inability for a lot of people to like adopt certain vaccines and approve certain vaccines under the guise of like we don't have enough data. But this is like a misunderstanding of how the scientific process actually works. So like data is used to discriminate between different theories, and viewing us only able to act when we have good enough data is like a misunderstanding of what a theory does in the first place. And so I do want to separate. So I'm not making the empiricist claim that we can only act when we have data. But what I am saying is that when your reasoning lies on probabilities, there are different sort of rules at play, right? So if you're gonna start comparing, like Vaden said, the results of RCTs and saying in expectation we expect this many lives to be saved based on the data and the assumptions we've made, This is very different than saying the probability of AI takeover is 30% in the next decade or something, because there's just completely different processes at work for how we get these numbers. I think these numbers, honestly, I think we should start writing these numbers differently. Like one of them we should write with like a little tilde over them or something, because it's very confusing that we're using the same symbols on paper, but these are like completely different concepts. And so one we should just like write in red pen or something. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that might have been a little hard to follow or garbled on my part, but I'm not saying that we can only act when we have data, but I am saying in the particular case of probability, we have to be very clear that a lot of these numbers are being generated by completely different processes. One of them being entirely subjective, and one of them being actually objective and coming from data, and therefore able to be corrected.
So that's true, and I feel like this is just worth digging into a lot further because it feels like a crux. So what do we say here? One point to raise, insofar as there is an important difference between subjective probabilities and more objective or so-called frequential probabilities, it's not obviously the case that we should take one more seriously than the other, or we should act only on the basis of one. Sometimes subjective probabilities matter a great deal. For instance, we need to have some guess about how a global pandemic will pan out, but we haven't experienced anything like that before, so we don't have any kind of frequencies to base our guesses on, but you need to make a call either way. And, you face lots of choices like that. So it's not obviously the case that we should ignore or take less seriously probabilities which aren't strictly derived from really good evidence.
That was a great example, by the way. When you're done, we should just zone in on the pandemic example. There's a lot going on there. Yeah, so that'd be great.
Right. So yeah, let's just like spell out what we are disagreeing about, which is there are different views of what probabilities are. And some people think you should just treat all probabilities the same, and some people think there are different kinds. So on one hand, there is a view of probability, which is you have a number between 0 and 1, and where it's appropriate to use, it's telling you about how the world is in a certain way. If I said that this coin I have, I'm going to flip it, and the chance it'll land heads is 0.5, you could translate what I'm saying there as being something like, in the limiting case, if I flipped it, a gazillion times, 50% of those times it's going to land heads, right? So it's a kind of fact about its propensity or the kind of frequency that it comes up. Either it has come up in the past or will come up in the future. There are like different ways to catch it out, but in any case, it's like a fact about the world. And then you have another camp of interpretations about what probabilities say. And the idea there is that probabilities don't immediately tell you about the world. Probabilities describe instead a fact about the mind of the person using them. So there's something like a degree of belief or strength of belief. So that's like a subjective interpretation of probability. And when you combine it with ideas about how to update those probabilities on new evidence, then you can call yourself a Bayesian. This is like a Bayesian like interpretation of probability. So those are like kind of two rough camps. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I think you hate Bayesians from the impression I got. So I don't feel like qualified to say anything kind of technically accurate, but I also feel tempted to stick up for the Bayesian side of this argument. And maybe the first thing to say, and I'll like shut up soon, but one thing to say, if you're a Bayesian, you are allowed to have subjective probabilities about anything, including those things which also obviously kind of fit the objective story. So if I flip my coin 100 times and it comes up heads 50 times, I'm allowed to have a subjective credence that the next flip will come up heads with a 50% chance. So in a sense, Bayesian epistemology, it starts with all the obvious stuff that an objective interpretation of probability will be first to point out, and extends it to places where someone who's more sympathetic to that objective interpretation will be scared to go. It's worth thinking of it as a kind of a way of extending notions of probability beyond the most obvious applications. So there's a continuity there rather than a disjoint between, RCT probabilities and then like sci-fi probabilities. So that's the first point to make.
Excellent. So, on the question of do I hate Bayesians? Do we hate Bayesian? No, I am a Bayesian. My entire research career is basically in Bayesian methods, and this is my sole publication output when it comes to machine learning is publishing Bayesian methods. And so, no, I'm 100% a Bayesian. I'm not a Bayesian epistemologist, though. That's where the big distinction lies, because I fully recognize the power of Bayesian methods in statistical reasoning.
Oh yeah, no one's denying Bayes' rule, right? Just to like get that out of the way.
Yeah. Which I was accused of somehow on the EA forum.
But it's also a statistical methodology, which is incredibly powerful and makes use of subjective knowledge. So I'm not even I don't have a problem with infusing subjective priors into our data analysis. That's also completely great. It's just what happens when you take out the data entirely. You're left with Bayesian epistemology, as contrasted against Bayesian statistics. So like when it comes to, when you said it's not necessarily clear which one is better, between subjective estimates of probability or objective estimates of probability. Here's a tiny little thought experiment. Imagine you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you you have brain cancer, and they say the probability of you living past your 30s is 90%. Then he says that comes from looking at 100,000 people who have brain cancers exactly like yours. You're going to feel one way. But imagine he says, that's just what I believe. It's just a belief of mine. I haven't looked at the data. This is a hunch. It's a gut feeling that with your style of cancer, I believe you're going to live past 30. Which one would you prefer? I would argue you'd prefer the one that's based on data, right? It's not necessarily about if the data...
I don't really understand what you're trying to get at there.
What I'm trying to get at is that probabilities derived from data are superior to probabilities derived purely from belief.
Of course they are. But who's saying that?
Did you not say earlier? I think it was that it's not necessarily clear which one is better, is I think the phrase that you used when it comes to subjective probability or objective probability.
Yeah.
And
so I think that's on me for not being clear enough about the two views we're comparing. So I'll try again. An objective interpretation of probability just takes those numbers between 0 and 1 to be saying something about the world, an objective fact about frequencies or propensities, right? The subjective family of interpretations of probability take those numbers to be saying something about something inside my head, right? About a strength of a belief. But clearly, you're allowed to base your beliefs on evidence. And in cases where you can, you obviously should. In fact, you should, use all the kind of available evidence and data that you can. So it's a boring philosophical distinction which doesn't matter most of the time, rather than a distinction about where you should draw your evidence from or what sources of data are best. Something like that.
I would say it matters a huge amount when you're given a probability and you don't know from which philosophical school it was derived. So in Ord's book, he gives probabilities associated with volcanic eruption, probabilities associated with nukes, probabilities associated with asteroid collisions. These are, again, like going to your doctor who's looked at 100,000 different examples of asteroid collisions. And then he gives a probability associated with AI takeover. And now he switched, right? He switched to subjective belief probability. There's no data. You can't possibly calculate the probability of AI takeover in this fashion. And that's where it matters. It matters a lot because this distinction is subsumed in the word subjective. And so Ord is very upfront. He's like, I'm using subjective estimates here. But I would claim that the readers don't realize what exactly is happening. It's just what that means when you just add the adjective subjective in front of it. Things change entirely. And just think about what this would be like in the domain of health and medicine. If doctors just switched in a cavalier way between talking about incidence of breast cancer, what derived from data, and just beliefs and gut feelings, also using the same word probability, and then they just start ranking things based on this. It matters a lot. It's not just a philosophical, empty discussion, because it is the fuel which allows people to mix probabilities associated with data with probabilities associated with nothing, just belief states.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where there is a practical difference, it's that fans of this objective class of interpretations of probability are going to balk at putting numbers on things where there isn't a strong enough body of evidence, whereas fans of a more kind of Bayesian approach are going to just like come up with a guess, drawing on similar examples from the past and mushing together more various sources and reasons. And you're saying that when that's not made clear, that you're drawing your number from second-rate sources, that can be misleading. I think it's unfair in the Toby Ord example. I think he's fairly upfront that these are... I mean, most people know what subjective means, right? And he also says, look, these could be an order of 3 wrong either way, but it would be unfair to the reader, or maybe kind of like patronizing to the reader, not to just like say my guesses about how likely these things are, because I've just written an entire book and you're probably wondering what they are. So you can, you should be trusted to like understand where these things are coming from. Maybe people don't understand them, but I would expect most people do.
Just one tiny point, and then just to finish this very super small point, which is that there's a third option available, right? And the third option is the one which Václav Smil took in his book, Global Catastrophes and Trends, which is to just not use subjective probabilities at all. Just rely on arguments in that case, and use probabilities to summarize data. But it's not a choice of either be honest about subjective probabilities or hide them. The third option is don't use them.
Vaden, everything you just said there is really great, and I think I might actually be with you there more than with Finn.
Wow.
Dude, we're looking for a third host on the podcast.
Here, this idea has one host.
Well, one thing I was going to bring up, and I'm again, like, I think it maybe comes to like a broader point of like how you message things and how you, especially, right, you communicate science and statistics with like the general public. Finn, where you said, like, you shouldn't patronize the reader. I think probably in the Toby Ord book, that does make sense. But he does also like add the numbers together, right? To give like one really nice headline figure, which is like 1 in 6, right? In the century. And that really literally just adds together the more objective probabilities or like frequentist stuff of asteroids with the subjective kind of AI thing to give one really nice figure, which, you know, is the first thing that comes up with if you're not going to read the book, right? You're still going to see the 1 in 6 number. So that's like where I think I really agree with Vaden's point, that I think that is actually something to consider more seriously, especially when these things build up on each other, right? And you then cite this in your next literature review and so on. I can definitely see how that kind of becomes a bit of a Ponzi scheme, right?
Beautiful
where
word.
It's all kind of building onto each other.
Also important to note that neither Ezra Klein or Sam Harris picked up on the subjective versus objective difference, right? He was on both of their podcasts, and both of them were just using this number, 1 out of 6, as if the different sources being fed into this function that gave the output were the same. And so, you know, these are two very smart people who both didn't mention it, and maybe they realized there was a difference, but they didn't say it. And so people who now haven't read the book, who are listening to their podcasts, which are in the millions, presumably, have this walking around with this number of 1 out of 6 in their head, which is just like Toby Ord's completely subjective belief, right?
No, that's a really good point.
I think that is actually a fair point. Maybe there's a worry about messaging. First thing to say there is that is separable from the more fundamental question of whether subjective probabilities are ever reasonable to talk about and come up with in the first place. Another point there is, in that specific example, maybe it's not such a bad thing that if people are going to take anything from that book, then that kind of headline figure, it gets people interested, and maybe that's not such a bad thing, and then they learn more if they are interested and find out that it's like less clear, it could actually be more, it could be less.
Imagine,
but it's a hook.
Choose your least favorite cause area, and imagine they did it.
If they did it honestly, then I would appreciate their honest guess. If it's like, I'm trying to sell this thing by coming up with the highest number that I can justify, then that would be bad. But it would be bad not because they are using a subjective interpretation of probability, but because they're being dishonest, which is just bad anyway.
Just a super tiny point of clarification, which I think is important, is that neither Ben nor myself are accusing or anyone of being dishonest, right? It's just No, it's just I think that it is a Ponzi scheme. Another philosopher referred to it as a scandal, and I think that is closer to the mark, which is that everyone is using the word probability and not realizing that very different things are going on. And so I think it's actually a public confusion, which even people as brilliant as Ord and Sam Harrison and Ezra Klein haven't recognized. So it's a giant mistake, not a intentional act of propaganda or what have you. So just to clarify that.
Yeah, and like it's a general science, right? Problem as well. I can point to like other examples, right, where it just seems more just bigger than that. One thing I wanted to ask Vaden and Ben then. So, if you say that there's this third way, right, of like not using subjective probabilities at all, but you also earlier said, right, that you're like generally sympathetic to things like AI safety. Or, extinction risks to some degree, even if it's not these more like sci-fi-esque risk kind of things. How do you justify that then? Is this like a question of like going back to a theory or using general intuitions or so? Because you still have to make, right, like some kind of trade-off. Like what kind of alternate decision-making kind of process would you propose then?
I'm actually not sympathetic to AI risk.
Okay, right. Sorry for assuming. Yeah.
We can maybe argue about that later. I think it's actually useful to return to Finn's thought experiment here about nuclear war. So the first thing I'll say is that I'm actually not going to say that people shouldn't use subjective probabilities. Like if they want to organize their own thoughts in specific ways and find it useful to generate arguments and sort out their own personal priorities by like assigning numbers to things, I don't care. And actually, this is one of the biggest problems I have with like the less wrong style of Bayesianism, is that it calls people irrational for not abiding by the subjective view of probability. And like, for me, I don't actually care how you come up with arguments, how you start prioritizing things, as long as you're open to like argumentation and criticism from other people. So anyway, I want to separate the criticism of subjective probabilities and the comparison of subjective and objective probabilities to just like using them. So if you want to use them to convince yourself of things or argue, that's fine. But we just have to recognize where they're coming from and like not compare them willy-nilly with objective probabilities. Yeah. But in the particular case of like nuclear war, so I think one thing you're smuggling in there is like, why do you need beliefs that obey the rules of probability? Like, what's the axiom of human rationality that says we must have a belief about the probability of nuclear war in the future, and that thing has to be a number between 0 and 1? Right. So this is like a huge assumption being made in this world of Bayesian epistemology that is like nowhere argued for, but is just like assumed. Like we must have beliefs that conform mathematically in these specific ways.
Yeah, I mean, one point there is it's getting a little in the like prudential self-interested case. You can just show that if you violate like the rules of updating on probability according to Bayesianism, then you just end up like, being Dutch booked. Yeah, you get kind of money pumped and whatever. You lose out over the long run.
Yeah, in a casino, if you're a casino and you don't use the rules of probability when designing your games, then you're going to consistently make loss. You're going to lose money, right? So the amount that roulette pays out for certain rolls of the wheel, that's not arbitrary. And if you deviate from, say, half on red, half on black, and it's like 3/4 payout, 3/4 on red and 1/4 on black, then you're going to lose money. But so then you could say that as a casino owner, your subjective probability needs to match what the objective case is. Otherwise, you're going to make decisions for your casino, which will make it go under. But this is a highly contrived example, and it's one that works only because we know how to set up chaotic systems which actually produce objective randomness in the world. So in situations where we know there's a source of true randomness, such as pachinko machines or roulette, in those limited cases, it makes sense to align your subjective credence to the objective probability. But this is the rare case. This is not the kind of reasoning that we can then adopt when reasoning about the future. We actually know, using explanatory theories, what physical systems produce actual randomness. And this is what computer programmers have to think about when they use random number generators, because it's actually really hard to produce random number generators that actually statistically make random events. So we know where randomness comes from in nature, and these are the only places where you can talk sensibly about mapping subjective credences onto the objective world. But these are chaotic and complex systems, as well as like Brownian motion and stuff. But again, this is limited cases.
Maybe a point to raise here is the track record of betting markets and prediction platforms, where you are betting on all sorts of things which do not meet the Vaden criteria for randomness, like political, like elections and how the pandemic is going to turn out. And the most like Vaden triggering of them all are like, will
triggering. I love it.
Yeah, will the like Riemann conjecture be proved either way, like in the next 10 years? Like, this is not random, but people place numerical probabilities on them. What's interesting is that once you make enough of these guesses, you can see if you're well calibrated or not. So where you've made a guess that something will turn out to happen with like a 20% probability, did it end up happening 20% of the time once you've made enough of those bets? And once you rack up that kind of track record, there it feels like you can be said to be either right or wrong, well calibrated or not, with respect to your guesses, even though those guesses were about like all kinds of things which aren't anything like digits of pi or casino spins.
Tiny thing. Listeners can go on the Wikipedia page for randomness, and then there's like a subsection, sources of randomness in nature, and that's the criterion that I'm using. It's not Vaden's criterion. It's where science like actually knows where randomness occurs. On the super forecaster thing, yeah, we talked about this a bunch with Mauricio, and just one tiny point to make is that a well-calibrated forecaster is allowed to say 0.5 when they don't know stuff. So you could have a forecaster, but
of course,
but
when you say I have a subjective credence of 0.5, you are not saying that if we ran the world 1,000 times, I'm pretty confident it's going to happen 500 times. You're saying I have no idea how many times it's going to happen, but my degree of belief that it will happen is about 0.5.
No, so my only point is that, quote, well-calibrated forecasters, it's not like a fount of wisdom about the future. It is just people either say, like if you split the world into that which I'm super certain about, that say Joe Biden will still be president in 2 years, not 4 years, and things that I'm completely uncertain about that I just don't know, like what is going to happen in 100 years from now. And you just ask me questions that are just that which I'm certain about or that which I'm uncertain about. It's like I know nothing about. Then I could be a perfectly well-calibrated forecaster, because we're not getting anything for free.
And that's a crucial point.
So yeah, that's my
absolutely.
Point.
So
yeah.
GIGO, right? Like garbage in, garbage out. You cannot learn anything which you didn't already know by putting numbers and stuff.
Great. Oh, I love that. Good.
And
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but there's something on the kind of grammatical surface of saying something is this value in expectation, or like the probability is such and such, where what you mean is my kind of degree of belief that it'll happen is this. And that's true as far as it goes. Like, it can be misleading maybe if you don't know what these people are talking about, that they actually know something about how many times these things would turn out if you like ran the world 1,000 times. But that's only like a surface level mistake. No one's claiming to know anything more by putting these numbers on stuff than they knew before, right?
Well, the surface level mistake goes pretty deep because people argue in favor of subjective views of probability by counting the frequency of super forecasters, right? And the frequency of their accurate or inaccurate predictions. So there's not a clear delineation of frequentist methods versus subjective methods. It all gets conflated, and out the other end comes just numbers which people don't know how they were derived. And so we should maybe get back to the long-termist subject, but this, like, it's an interesting irony that one of the best arguments for Bayesian credences is through frequencies.
I mean, to tie that into the long-termism thing is like one of the biggest, I think possibly the only argument for AGI being a big danger is just citing the credences, quote unquote, of experts. Right. And saying like they believe that within 50 years, there's going to be AGI that does so and so. And we need to take this shit seriously because look at these numbers. My God. Right. So there's no like one layer deeper of like, let's look at the arguments. And so I have a thought experiment for you both. Like, say you have two forecasters. For the audience, forecaster is just someone who's like predicting things about the future. And one of them has a track record of like 90% correct, right? This guy's a fucking super, or she is a super forecaster like none other, right? And one of them sucks, like 0.2, like worse than chance, is just terrible. And they're both telling you their guess at like whether AGI is going to take over the world in the next 100 years. Would you actually would you give more weight to the opinion of the super forecaster with like with their track record, or would you actually just forget the numbers and examine their arguments?
I mean, this is like probably the silliest answer, but like if the second forecaster is so bad, right, that it like negatively correlates in some way, then that could be
just
like
do the opposite of whatever they say.
Right? yeah, do the opposite. Yeah.
I feel like you mentioned this in another podcast, but I remember you raised a really great point, which doesn't, as far as I can tell, undermine anything deep about like Bayesian epistemology, but it's a mistake people make, which is if you just like hand out a survey to 100 AI experts asking these like unanswerable questions about when general artificial intelligence will arrive, and like everyone who gets that survey, they're like, I don't have a fucking idea, but I have to put a number because, you know, I'm getting like paid or whatever.
It's a survey.
I'll just put like off the top of my head. And then like those answers come back and you see that one person thinks that AGI will arrive by 2050 and the next person thinks it'll arrive by 2045. And you think, hey, these are all clustering around the same point. Now that 100 people have said it'll arrive by this point, we should be way more confident that it will than compared to just asking one person, because we can aggregate their beliefs and come up with this like even stronger, more confident belief.
Look at the posterior.
Right, exactly. And that's often inappropriate, and it's going to give you a like way false sense of confidence where just everyone is equally clueless, and you can't turn collective cluelessness into a kind of combined confidence. Killer alliteration.
I think you've just undermined one paper that Bostrom and Ord co-wrote, because I think Nick Bostrom literally did that and published a paper on it with Toby Ord. And so I'm glad to hear you say that, because it is a ridiculous methodology, but it is one which is published by Ord and Bostrom.
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on how independent you think those guesses are, right? So if you think they're all drawing on like totally independent reasons and sources of evidence, then you should think that they combined something stronger. And maybe I don't really know what you're talking about. But yeah, no, maybe that is a mistake you can make. And like a slightly more mundane example is you get some howlers, especially in like pop science writing.
Is howlers some English word, or what is
like
that?
An egregious error?
Like yeah. Some egregious errors. Okay, so like I've never said it as well. So people come up with like a pop sci claim, like eating ginger like makes you happier, whatever, and they'll look at the literature.
Seems reasonable.
And they'll see 10 published papers, and they all have positive results, and their p-values are all obviously nice and low. So you think, my God, 10 papers, you know, that means the chance that that eating ginger doesn't make you happy is just like rock bottom, right? Because how can they all come to that conclusion? And that's a case, I think, where a Bayesian style approach starts to look quite attractive, because you can say things like, how likely do I think this is before I looked at these papers? How many papers are going to find a null result and get rejected? And you start thinking about things like publication bias, which don't show up in just the p-values you get at the end of that process. And that's a case where that's pretty sensible. I'm not suggesting you think it's not, but it is a nice example of a kind of subjective style approach working quite well.
No, to dive into that example, I mean, what does the end process of that reasoning look like? So for me, I'd say, there's all these confirmatory papers. It doesn't, there's the file drawer effect, the well-known file drawer effect in social sciences. We don't know how many papers that, tried to run the study and found negative results. Should my conclusion here to be to like put a number on my prior belief, update it with all the confirmations, then make a guess at how many like disconfirmatory cases are hiding in someone's file drawer, and then have like a number 0.16 at the end of the day? Or is it just to be like pretty skeptical of the claim? And why do I have to put a number on it? So there's this like extra step I find that's often taken in like the Bayesian world, where yes, you're right, like Bayesian style reasoning in terms of like updating, quote unquote, whatever language you want to use with new evidence coming in. Of course, we're in favor of that. That's what criticism and evidence are for, right? To help us like shape how we think about the worlds and slowly converge to truth. But this extra step of going from I think something's likely or unlikely, or like I'm pretty skeptical of it, or like, I need more arguments before I make up my mind, to like, well, I have this probability that's, 0.33. That's the extra step where I just like, it seems so silly to, try and get that. But when it happens is like, once we've made that step, then we have a number, and numbers are great because we can compare that number with other numbers. And then we get into this dangerous territory of like, we started out our reasoning process saying, yes, of course, all this is highly subjective, I'm just going to put a number on it. But then we forget. A year later, we find this like paper and we have this number and we're like, holy shit, 33% that ginger increases life expectancy or whatever. Deworming only has like a 10% chance of working. So we better just give everyone ginger, and just forget that this number was like, kind of conjured. It's just the sources are not the same. Anyway.
But that's nothing wrong with the underlying philosophical view that motivates putting numbers on things you're uncertain about. That's a problem with people misunderstanding it, which is separate, right? Like,
yeah, no, I agree. Like I said earlier, I don't have if someone really wants to go through the trouble of like putting a number on every one of their beliefs, then that's fine. I'm just, as soon as we start comparing those numbers with like other numbers derived from like more from better sources of information, that's what I have a problem with. And I think that kind of I think it's rare, I guess, in practice that the Bayesian withholds comparing completely subjective beliefs with like other kinds of numbers.
Yeah, the problem can't be comparing slightly uncertain things with fully certain things. Like maybe you think one pill improves your sleep quality by like 2%, and we just know that absolutely for sure for everyone. And then another pill, for some people it's been like 3%, and some people it's been 1%. You can compare those things, or maybe you're like not sure how effective the third pill is because you haven't run enough studies, and it's appropriate to come up with like guesses there and compare them, and then you can just draw this continuum between those cases where you have a little bit of uncertainty and you're kind of okay with that, to cases where there's a lot more uncertainty and it's not clear that there is a kind of shining line where you just like can't go any further.
I'd say the shining line is just probabilities derived from data should be compared with probabilities derived from data, and probabilities not derived from data should not be compared with probabilities not derived. Like, just the data is the shining line. Notice I say data, I don't say Bayesian versus frequentist interpretation, because you have all sorts of excellent Bayesian statistics, which is about doing exactly what you are highlighting.
But what is data, right?
Measurements of the world.
But what's a measurement of the world?
This is the philosopher in Finn coming out.
Like every belief I have comes from some kind of observation, right?
Counting bed nets.
What is data?
We may be getting into semantics, but if you could put it in an Excel table, that would be what I'm referring to as data. Yeah, like if you could perform statistical analyses on it, that's what I mean. I'm not using an exotic word here. I'm just being counting hospitalizations due to COVID, counting malaria bed net distribution and contrasting that against reports of malaria. This is what GiveWell is so great at doing. So whatever GiveWell does is what I'm talking about when I say data. I'm not using anything exotic.
One thing I'm like a little bit concerned about, and just like a genuine question, I haven't really thought much about this, is that I definitely see what you're saying, Vaden, that there's lots of scenarios where this conflation is really problematic and can lead to really bad outcomes. But I can just also see a lot of scenarios where all you have, right, is one subjective probability for one thing and a more like evidence-based probability for another thing. And you still have to make some sort of decision. Like I'm kind of struggling a bit in like making this like more action term, I guess. And like, how do you just end up making decisions then, right? Like in the real world?
Based on theories and criticism. So it's not the case that all you have is a subjective probability estimate. You also have explanations about how the world works, arguments that are trying to point out flaws in those explanations. And you make decisions in the real world by the method of conjecture and refutation. You take a guess about what decision is going to best lead to positive outcomes. If you don't have data, then all you can do is try to get your friends and peers and colleagues to criticize it. And
have you ever read someone called Karl Popper? I think you'd really enjoy it.
Oh, what can I say? I think I'm fairly repetitive on this point by now, but I just have to keep repeating myself because the same questions keep reoccurring. And so,
that's fair. And I'm definitely not saying that's like the wrong approach to take. I think it was more just like a thing for me and like kind of clearing it up. Totally. Just because it is the fact, right, that you often just have like very mixed things to go off from, some of which are going to be subjective, some of which are going to be or like more evidence-based, and you just need to use them all, right, to reach a decision. And you're not saying that, you just ignore all the subjective stuff and you only rely on the evidence. If I understand you right, what you're saying is you just take that all together and then you make a decision. You don't like have to, draw up a table and work out all your like expected value thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's, I don't tend to think of the primitive building blocks as being evidence and subjective beliefs. I think of it as being theories and explanations and criticism. And so these are the things which are that unify both the data case and the not data case. All we have are theories and criticism. Sometimes the criticism can take the form of data, not all the time. And when it doesn't, then you have to rely on other forms of criticism. But notice that nothing that I've said is subjective. It is a objective property of what Popper would say is the third world, but it's an output of human cognition. Einstein's theory of relativity is objective. He could change his mind on it. He could believe something different and it wouldn't matter because the theory would stand on its own. It doesn't matter what he believes. He could believe tomorrow that it's all wrong if he was still alive, but it wouldn't matter because it was written down and now we can think about it in its own terms, right?
I might be completely off the mark here. So Vaden, definitely tell me if I'm wrong here, but like I definitely agree with the sentiment that theory is really important and is something that is really being neglected. So like the thing I'm kind of thinking about is with like advances in machine learning and stuff where you can get decisions, right? But they're incredibly opaque and you have no theory behind them whatsoever. And you're just relying on this like very opaque kind of decision making thing for you that you have no control over. Like a lot of theory gets lost. And when that gets applied to certain criterias and then you just kind of agree with whatever accuracy, right, you have, and then you take that as your probability of if it's right or wrong. Like just that track record, that can be really problematic if you don't actually understand the theory underlying it. And you shouldn't be misplacing trust in there. And that I definitely see. And I definitely agree with.
Yeah. So like an example I've used in the past to kind of emphasize this point is let's say we invented like deep learning before we invented meteorology. So you can imagine training deep models to predict if it's going to rain or snow or hail tomorrow. And we could predict it with a high degree of accuracy. And then when people say, well, what's actually happening in the real world? What do you, then all the scientists just throw up their hands and basically say, well, it's not up to us to make any decisions or have any theory about what's actually going on. It's, it could be Zeus. It could be solar flares. It could be Apollo. all we care about is prediction.
David Deutsch gives a great example there, where he imagines we landed ourselves with some oracle which can tell us whether our predictions are true or false with perfect accuracy. That would be surprisingly not very useful if we're trying to, for instance, like build a spaceship or something. Because where do you start? You need ideas, and that you can't just get ideas from things you already know and asking how likely they are and this kind of thing.
Exactly.
I think one thing we might be getting confused about is this kind of broader, weaker view, which is a subjective interpretation of probability. Roughly the view that some probabilities make claims about mental states rather than the world. And then a like slightly more specific, kind of more knotty view about science, which is like a kind of Bayesian philosophy of science. And again, I think you can pull those things apart, and you can be really into the Popperian view of science, while also thinking that it's appropriate to use subjective estimates of probability. So for what it's worth, I think my own view is something like that kind of this very broad Bayesian epistemology is pretty plausible. So I think most things just end up untouched. Maybe that's kind of unfair, but that's kind of where my head is. Okay, so it feels worth moving on and bringing this back to long-termism. So for context, you, Vaden, wrote a hit piece against long-termism. One of the points you made was that long-termists rely on taking an expectation over the very long-run future. They then point out how kind of enormous it is, and then they justify things on that basis. Your point is that it's not that the far future is big in expectation, it's actually undefined in expectation, because it's not appropriate to take an expectation over that kind of thing. And the example or reason you give is to imagine an infinite set of alternating black and white balls or something in a big infinite urn. And this is a kind of neat and surprising fact about infinite sets where you don't have a measure over them. You can ask a question like, I'm going to pick out a ball at random. What's the probability that it's white? And the naive answer is 50%. And the true answer is, correct me if I'm wrong, actually undefined without a measure. And a measure is, it's kind of just a way of getting legitimate probabilities when you start asking questions about infinite sets. And that is cool and true as far as it goes. My point is that if that argument applies to long futures, finite but very long futures, then presumably also applies to short futures. But we can reason about short futures, so it doesn't apply to long futures. And just to draw that out, when long-termists make their argument in terms of taking an expectation over the very long-run future, they are not normally interested in infinite value, and certainly they don't rely on it. They're interested in very long finite timescales and very large but finite amounts of value. So the range of possible futures is going to be very big, but it's not qualitatively different to the range of futures for the next year or the next decade or the next century. So if you want to say that in order to take an expectation over the next decade, you need to consider an infinite set of outcomes, then, sure, you can't take an expectation over what's going to happen in the next decade. But if you don't need to worry about infinite sets in the decade case, then the question is, at what point do they enter in? Is it centuries or millennia? And if they don't enter in at all, then the point doesn't go through. And if they do enter in at all, then the point proves too much, and it just says that we can't reason about the future at all. So that's roughly the kind of response I was going for, and hopefully that makes sense.
Totally. Great. So just to repeat back the concern to make sure that we all are on the same page, you grant the infinite set case, but the worry is that, tomorrow there's an infinite set of things that could happen as well. And we obviously reason about tomorrow probabilistically. So why can't we reason about tomorrow 1 billion years from now probabilistically? Because it's a continuum. It's not like a discrete change. And so what gives? Is that fair?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, nice. So this is perfect. So we were talking earlier about objective views of probability, subjective views, but there's a third one, which is often neglected from the conversation, like people in the future. And it's the instrumental view of probability. And that's the one which I claim is the only real way to think about this without paradox. Because, of course, you can assume a measure onto an infinite set. Of course, you can do that. You can assume that of the infinite different things that could happen, AI takeover is going to have a probability of 0.3, and everything else is going to be constant compared to that. So people assume assume measures over infinite sets however they like, whenever they want to. That's fine. The instrumental view says there is no intrinsic probability associated with the future. And there's no intrinsic subjective probability estimate either. It's just the only question is, what is useful in service of accomplishing some goals? So what's a useful assumption to make in order to accomplish some task at hand? That is what Bayesian statistics is all about. That's what statistics just in general is all about, and what modeling is all about. Is for tomorrow, I have a dinner party, and I'm going to put a probability distribution over the people who are attending, because that is useful for me to get an estimate over the attendees. I can do that. I can also put a probability distribution over what's going to happen a billion years from now. I can do that too. These are just assumptions we make. And then the only question is, whose assumptions are better, and what is the best set of assumptions we can make in order to accomplish certain goals, right? And so we use data to do that in the short and immediate term. And the thing that gets harder and harder is adjudicating between whose sets of assumptions are better, because we have less and less information to use for adjudication. And so that is why there's no proving too much here. The only thing that it kills is this Bayesian absolutism, which says we have to assign credences to our beliefs. That's the only attack that it makes. But there's no paradox between an infinite set of things happening in the future and an infinite set of things happening when I flip a coin. Like, it could be the case that somebody detonates a bomb in between the coin flip, and therefore the probability of it landing heads is also undefined. That's fine. I could make that assumption. It's just that it's not a very reasonable one, and it's not a very useful one, because it doesn't help me to accomplish my goal at hand.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to what you're saying about when it is and isn't appropriate to take expectations over super uncertain and super far out events. What I am not so sure about is that the particular argument you make in terms of infinite sets is very relevant at all. Yeah, it would be surprising if a kind of neat observation about measure theory could tell us something significant about these kind of things. And then on the point about instrumentalism, yeah, I mean, that sounds interesting and plausible. One way to push back is, you said, look, the question is, whose assumptions are better, right? Or whose estimates are better. And if by better you mean whose assumptions are just more true or more accurate.
No, I mean more useful.
Yeah, right. So it's between either more true or more accurate, or more useful. If you're going in for more useful, I'm not saying anything new here, right? But the kind of canonical pushback to any kind of instrumentalist view is that it seems that there are cases where a guess might not be useful but might be more true, or the most useful guess might be less true. And it feels a little, I don't know, kind of postmodern or something.
Oh, no, definitely not. Excellent. Yeah.
That was deliberately triggering,
yeah,
right? But,
yeah. Okay, so I do, yeah. So the common concern against instrumentalism is that it just leads to relativism, that it's my usefulness versus your usefulness. And that is very much the reason why I'm not an instrumentalist in the domain of epistemology. Knowledge is not just about usefulness. Knowledge is about what's actually true. Probability is not the same as knowledge. Probability is mainly about usefulness, except in very certain circumstances, which I can enumerate, where we have physical theories that tell us we expect randomness to occur in nature. So casinos and chaotic events are precisely those ones where there is an underlying truth of the matter because, for example, the central limit theorem is going to happen whether or not I believe in it. So that is where there is some truth there, and that is the rare case. So instrumentalism as applied to knowledge is very susceptible to your critique, and that's why I'm not an instrumentalist when it comes to epistemology. But when it comes to probability, probability is just a tool that is useful in most cases. The other corner case is quantum mechanics, but I'm not going to go there. I want to make one other point, which is like it seems completely irrelevant to the discussion of long-termism. And that's a fair point. Why would we care about this stupid infinite set thing in the case of like moral values and stuff, right? And so the majority of my piece, I focus on other aspects, right? But if I didn't also provide a technical argument against both of their assumptions. So in the case for strong long-termism, they list two assumptions. And so I needed to both point out that I think this is a immoral philosophy come ideology, but I also needed to refute it on its own terms, right? And so the refutation of long-termism on its own terms necessitated a technical argument undermining its assumptions. Otherwise, the critique that I'm attacking it based on negative conclusions would be thrown because I had to undermine the actual argument itself. So
I think it's worth just restating that the case for long-termism, or at least this kind of expected value case, it relies on putting a kind of plausible-ish floor on the potential value of the long-run future. So all you need to get going is a claim like the future, it seems, pretty likely that it could be enormously valuable. And that's pretty much all you need. The numbers are actually not necessary, but they are kind of, you can see how they're nice if you're like an analytic philosopher and you want to give the impression of being, rigorous and technical. So although this particular style of reasoning might be inappropriate, I'm not sure criticizing that style of reasoning gets at the claim that comes out of it, even the strong claim, because all the arguments don't need you to come up with like an accurate guess as to the actual quote unquote size of the future and expectation.
The use of words instead of numbers, I think, is an excellent suggestion. And I have no problem with people talking about, yeah, I'm pretty sure such and such is going to happen, or I'm pretty unsure that such, that's great. What I am concerned about is Shivani in the case for strong long-termism, where she takes numbers pulled out of thin air and compares it to the expected value of malaria charities. This is not me saying people are doing this. This is one of the main components of the argument is that if you are Shivani and you have to decide what where to put your money, you should also reason like her. You should compute the expected value of totalitarian world governments and AI doomsday and John Hamm, and then you should compare that to GiveWell's expected values. And this is seen as like the pinnacle of reasoning. This is an extended narrative was made about Shivani that fed through the entire paper. And the point of this is that we're all Shivani. Like, this is the point that McCaskill and Greaves are making. We are all Shivani. We should do what Shivani does, which is to basically give up on Africa, give up on poverty fighting, and we should just put money into long-termism. Or better, we should set up a constitutionally dedicated long-termist foundation. Or better, if we don't have money to do that or time, we should go into long-termism research directly. It's this black hole of ideology which is just sucking everything into it. And I think using words instead of precise numerical values would be a very useful way to prevent this slide from happening. So I agree.
This might be cut, but one pushback there is that you can just translate the argument that gets given in the paper you're talking about.
No, you can't.
In terms of vaguer words, and then you just get the same conclusion but vaguer. It's not as if the conclusion doesn't come when you get less precise. It's just the argument for it becomes less precise.
I don't think that's true. I think they're relying on the very precise numbers that you get by comparing like the number of lives saved for GiveWell versus like the 10 to the 3 or whatever lives saved if you donate to AI safety. Like it's very explicit about the number of future people, the probability of saving lives for AI safety. And as soon as you replace a possible 10 to the 15 people with the sentence, the future could possibly be pretty big, the reasoning does not follow at all. Now you have vague things about maybe AI is a problem. GiveWell, we have pretty good evidence that GiveWell is very effective, on the order of a life saved for $3,000. And now you can't do arithmetic with those statements, right? And so now you actually have to dive into the arguments for thinking like, why is AI safety a problem? Why could it be a problem? Like, what's the evidence for that? And so I don't think it's true that the argument would go through if you start using vaguer language. I think it's like a full stop to the long-termism thing.
Expected values aren't defined over words, right? It's defined only over numbers.
I don't know if this is helpful or not, but it might be worth just like emphasizing then, if I understand you right, that the point is not just our earlier discussion, right, of like subjective probabilities and issues with exactly what that number is, but bringing in this other thing of like this astronomical value of the future, which is infinity or just some really big number, and then multiplying it together. So just to like kind of reiterate, it's not just the problem that the probability bit is wrong. It's bigger than that. It's that you then go on to multiply it with this insane number. Whether that initial subjective probability is 70% that there's going to be a nuclear war in 1,000 years, or 0.00001% or what have you, it doesn't really matter. It's the like multiplying it by infinity thing and then using that to come up with your decision. That's the issue.
Precisely. And because you couldn't do this when you have data, right? Like, so from a frequentist perspective, fine, but also from a Bayesian statistical perspective, also you can't just come up with arbitrarily large numbers pulled out of thin air because there's something to constrain you. There's some thing that will tell you if your assumption is right or wrong. But when you are allowed to just pull up numbers and call them probabilities, and then everything starts to become this just mushy goo of large numbers multiplied by small numbers, and then a giant story is weaved behind it. Yeah.
Well, hang on. Is the problem that we are paying too much attention or worrying too much about high stakes and low probabilities? Or is the worry that those probabilities are too arbitrary? My guess is that there are actually two worries here. One worry is that if you go along expected value style reasoning, even when the probabilities you use are entirely like au fait and objective, then you could end up still with kind of unreasonable sounding conclusions about the things we should do, because the choices you make are dominated by outcomes which are very, very unlikely, but if they were to happen, they'd be like exceptionally bad or exceptionally good.
Which is why Ben and I continuously emphasize the arguments and explanations and theories component, right? Like that's the thing that is the thing that's really under consideration. And the probability is just a stand-in for the fact that, say, we have a decent understanding of how to make nuclear weapons, and the theory that there may be a nuclear mistake is reasonable enough to put money to preventing this from happening. But subjective probabilities is never a focal point of our thinking when it comes to the world. It's always about theories and explanations, and then subjective probabilities are sometimes like a nice to have on top of that, but not anything to take much more seriously than that.
Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to like make that distinction, because it does feel like there are kind of two things going on rather than one. And when you say this style of reasoning, I think you're like referring to two things. One, just to be clear, one is like subjective probabilities, and the other is expected value reasoning.
The style of reasoning, just like for listeners, you don't have to know anything about expected values. It's just make up some crazy scenario, assume it's really unlikely, but if it happens, it would be devastating, and then get everyone to work on that instead of things we concretely know about, like poverty. And That's the problem I have. And the only reason that this is taken so seriously is because of all this probability stuff that lies underneath it. But again, the focus of the thing that I think is a bad idea is doing that. And then the reason people do that is because of all of this giant iceberg-like structure of philosophy that lies underneath it. But it's just a bad style of argumentation that has very damaging consequences.
Yeah. This is literally just like to clear up my understanding here. So Finn is saying they're two different things, and they are two different things. But like the point is that the types of arguments are made kind of rely on both things, because even if you use infinity and stuff, but then you don't use subjective probabilities, you just look at the evidence, because there is no evidence, right? Just because we don't have the data on AI takeover or anything that's going to happen in the future, then you have infinity, but you have probability 0, right? And then it's not something you kind of need to worry about. It's sci-fi, right? It's kind of fiction stuff. So it is the fact that both things are relevant here, because you kind of need both.
And also, it only gives, like, we didn't have this giant literature of people, celebrating the use of subjective probabilities, no one would argue in this style, because it's self-evidently ridiculous. But it's only because it's taken, it's given such currency, because every conversation pointing out the ridiculousness of this quickly moves into a conversation about probability. And then that's what you're arguing about. And so it's necessary to go into the probability stuff because you have to argue in the weeds. But ultimately, that is just the reason why this kind of argumentation has gotten such currency and is doing such damage. Like, it's something that Ben mentioned at the end of, I think, our first giant shot at long-termism, which is just like, we all care about the future. And like Popperian philosophy kind of highlights is that the best way to help the future is to just work on solving problems right here, right now, that we know how to solve. And a huge problem that I'm like super interested in is the problem of trying to enable self-education in developing countries, because I think that if like kids in say Africa and India were able to like self-educate using the internet and stuff, then we would have just huge amounts of knowledge coming out, and that would, I think, be like the meta X risk that would address all of these other concerns, right? Huge. And so like you can frame that concern from purely a long-termist lens. You can say, I care about the long term. The best way to safeguard the long term is to enable knowledge production now, because the one thing that the future is going to need is more knowledge. And the best way to do that is education. And so you could frame it this way. And notice that I don't have to talk about probabilities. I just talk about the power of knowledge, right? And so that's the main thing. Yeah.
That is really interesting. And I think it hits, interestingly enough, on one of the reasons why I'm really keen about long-termism generally, is that I feel you do need to take this kind of approach in order to justify those types of interventions. So we talked a lot, right, about kind of GiveWell and this really like evidence RCT backed kind of studies. But it's also really important to notice that those studies are based on like a very narrow perspective of like what they're actually measuring. A lot of those RCTs are from a very explicit cost benefit analysis, which means you look at the dollar cost and you look at the dollar benefit. And the dollar benefit they typically look at is wages. And wages is a really poor indicator, right? If you're interested in education and this kind of knowledge creation and the ideas that, you know, benefit things more broadly, it's really badly to look at just like, you know, what wage a scientist or something might get paid for the value they're creating. And I feel that if the consequence of rejecting long-termism is that you only then look at these kind of GiveWell studies, which are really great and I think add a lot of value into it, but really also mean you're losing out on these other types of interventions that might be really useful. You're actually hurting the kind of causes you're trying to promote here.
I would just disagree that you need long-termism in order to justify looking at other outcomes, right? So I think the criticism there is that RCTs and development economics can be too particular in its goals, right? Or its methods are constrained. And we should realize that. We should criticize them and potentially fund studies to look at other things, or be on guard for only paying attention to that which can be measured very absolutely. And that's a totally valid criticism to make. And trying to look at other things, or rather looking at like other studies to fund, or just paying attention to other things, is a valid criticism that can be made totally independently of long-termism. So maybe you can just illuminate where long-termism would actually start doing work there for you, because I don't think I see that bit.
Okay. If you take like a more long-term perspective, and I'm not talking about 1,000 years here, but if you just take like the general heuristic that you want to build a world that's really good in 50 years, and then that is your, we can say, proxy goal or something, and then you break down, okay, what do we need for that? And then you say, okay, well, we need economic growth for that. What drives economic growth? Economic growth gets driven by technologies, which gets driven by inventions, which gets driven by education. And therefore, I prioritize education. Now, this has nothing to do with this kind of expected value utility thing we were talking before, but it does come from a long-term perspective of you're interested in creating a world that's not just good tomorrow or in a week's time or in a year. It's good in the long term. And from that, you then reason back that education is something you care about and you're willing to promote, even if that means not giving money to malaria nets or deworming pills, right? I think that's where I'm kind of coming from.
One thing that I dislike about the term X risk is it carries the assumption that every other problem besides this is less important. And so I think that there are many different ways to view how to best make the world a better place for our descendants. One is taking an education perspective, and that's kind of the one that I like, but another is taking economics perspective, and another is taking an environmental perspective, and another is taking a gender equality perspective or a marriage equality perspective. There's 1,000 different lenses that we can use to view how to make the world better, and I think that that's great. And I think that everybody should have a kind of a personal relationship with that argument which appeals most to them, and then work on that. But the implication, or not an implication, like the direct view of people at FHI and stuff is that there are actually only 4 or 5 things that are important. These are the existential risks, and everything else that's a non-existential risk is almost by definition less important. And this is like directly stated on the 80,000 Hours website, and just the way that they talk about prioritizing long-term things over short-term things. And Finn, you're shaking your head, so you should respond. But yeah.
Okay, look, I'm not saying I agree with those claims, but I'm also keen to make some distinction here between claims about what's best to do at the margin and what would be best for everyone to do in absolute terms in some ideal world. So do fans of long-termism think that other interventions are not important? Obviously not. And I'm not suggesting you think they are saying that, but they're not, to be clear.
May I read a quote, just to give a flavor of like what I'm referring to? So this comes from Nick Bostrom, and I think it is one of his first papers on existential risk. So he's talking about events like Chernobyl, Bhopal, volcano eruptions, earthquakes, droughts, World War I, World War II, epidemics of influenza, smallpox, the Black Plague, and AIDS. And about this, he writes, these types of disasters have occurred many times, and our cultural attitude towards risks have been shaped by trial and error in managing such hazards. But tragic as these events are to the people immediately affected, in the big picture of things, from the perspective of humankind as a whole, even the worst of these catastrophes are just mere ripples on the surface of the great sea of life. They haven't significantly affected the total amount of human suffering or happiness, or determined the long-term fate of our species. This is in the seminal paper on existential risk. So the implication, if not the direct belief, this direct statement, is that the only thing that matters are existential risks, and things like World War I, World War II, AIDS, and influenza and smallpox are mere ripples. Mere ripples. So this is what I'm drawing attention to. I guess there's no problems whatsoever with working on smallpox or AIDS or preventing world wars. These are all legitimate concerns. But when you call the thing that you're working on existential risks and everything else that other people are working on short-termist, then this is carrying the implication that the problems that you deem to be significant are more significant than everybody else's problems. And I would never in 1,000 years say that enabling children to self-educate in developing countries is so important that not doing that is an existential risk. It's almost like moral blackmail. To accuse people who don't share my view as contributing to the suicide of our species is what this is implying. And this is a huge conversation stifler.
Also, to provide another example, unfortunately, I don't have a quote for it, so you'll just have to take it on faith that I'm representing the views of people faithfully. But I think probably you guys have come across this too. Like I've been in lots of conversations with people sympathetic to long-termism who have like stopped caring about animal welfare, for example, because they think it's like a very short-term cause, and with clean meat on the way, the amount of suffering is like it's finite, right? And so it can't possibly be with us for more than, say, like 50 years, at which point we'll have like clean meat. And so they're choosing to work on like very long-term nebulous problems, like certain existential risks. Are going to work on AGI and not caring about animal welfare, precisely because of these arguments. So anyway, just another example of how like it really does impact your day to day and like what you value.
It just to like add something. This is the explicit moral recommendation from the case for strong long-termism. So the idea then is, for the purpose of evaluating actions, we can in the first instance often simply ignore the effects contained in the first 100 or 1,000 years. What do you think people are doing when they ignore animal suffering? They're following the recommendations from FHI, the explicit ones. And so this is the problem that Ben and I are trying to highlight, which is that this flattens everything.
I think one absolutely crucial point to make here is that, at least on the best exposition of long-termism, the claim is not that the long term matters because the short term doesn't matter anymore. Or that the short term doesn't matter any less. Everything we already cared about stays fixed. All of those things are just as important in absolute terms as they were before. And what's happened here is that we've just, if you buy into it anyway, the idea is that we've realized there's this kind of repository of like potential value and potential suffering that is potentially even greater. So it's not like you become like any less obliged to avoid kind of certain.
But you can trade off between those things now, right?
Yes,
so you can make.
By the way, I want to, just at risk of sounding like a psychopath, I want to caveat what I've said by saying that's what the long-termists like would say, right? Like I'm not so, don't know what I would go for, but that's the idea. Sure, like if you kind of normalize by what's more relatively important than anything else, then short-term interventions become less relatively important. But that's a kind of trivial consequence that you get all the time. Like if you recognize that animals have moral patienthood, then humans are less morally significant as a proportion of all the sentient beings in the world once you make that realization. But that's like neither here nor there, right? But I think you're making a really important point, and I think we should talk about it more.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with Ben, what you said there about like trade-offs and stuff. And I think if somebody can credibly show me how like eating meat is going to bring on like a faster, like clean meat future, I can like imagine like becoming convinced and finding that all right. I just think I just often see those claims being made and not really being backed up in that kind of way.
I just wanted to pick up on something Finn said about how it's not that we're saying short-term suffering doesn't matter. It's just that in absolute terms, when you compare it against the future suffering, it's a smaller slice of the pie. There's some suffering now, but there's a potentially infinite amount of suffering in the future, and that's what we need to address. I would just say that your response is what any utopian philosophy would be able to say, right? We're not saying that the lives of the working class don't matter. We're just saying that the best way to improve the lives of the working class is to overthrow the capitalist bourgeoisie system, right? And so, of course, the suffering matters. It's just the most effective way to reduce suffering is to try to overthrow the capitalist hegemony. This would be kind of the style of argument that would be made. And the problem is always comparing a potential infinite well of future goodness against finite suffering right now. And that's the similarity between long-termism and other utopian forms of philosophy.
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about the kind of slightly more technical worries about formal frameworks. And now it feels like we've moved on to kind of practical and epistemic.
Yeah, so there's an interesting distinction that I've seen made a couple times now where people say, listen, you're attacking, say, the implementation of these ideas. And in practice, like your critique, that makes sense. In practice, fine. But theoretically, you haven't really touched the theory. You haven't touched the underlying core ideas. It's just you're criticizing the implementation. I only care about implementation. I only care about the practical consequences of a philosophy. The deep theoretical underpinning is not a concern of mine. That interests other people. That's fine. But when it comes to ethical and moral philosophies, I only care what it actually does in regards to how people treat one another. And if what it does is it makes people, say, downweight the significance of providing pain relief medication to the poor and upweight the significance of working on John Hamm problem scenarios, then I don't care how beautiful the underlying theory is. I care only about the practical implications. Yeah.
You can get rid of the baby and keep the bathwater in the sense that you can change course, realize that there's some core to the theory that is plausible, and then the practical working out is really worrying. Let's kind of notice that worry and then realize that kind of core thought behind long-termism in a less horrendous way. So presumably the theory and the practice both matter. But I was going to mention here, there's a kind of interesting comparison to other kind of arguments that you hear. So what's the criticism here? It's something like, long-termism claims to make the world go better in the very long run if it were put into practice, something like that. And then you say, look, the kind of reasoning that long-termism is using is just the kind of reasoning that totalitarian regimes of the past used to justify all manner of harms and persecution and human tragedies. So even if, in theory, you claim to care about doing the good thing in the long run, I have a reason to expect that in practice, even if your intentions are perfectly good, that you could very well end up doing an awful lot of harm, right? Okay, I said there was a comparison, and then the comparison is to these kind of self-undermining objections in the case of other ethical views like utilitarianism, where you get a thought like this. Utilitarianism says that the best actions, the best things to do are those actions which maximize well-being or other good consequences. But if we only acted on that basis, according to that rule, and we didn't care about things like telling the truth and respecting people's autonomy or rights, then people would lose faith and trust in one another, and just like all kind of institutions of truth-telling and trust would just crumble, and actually the consequences would be terrible. So like far from, maximizing well-being, utilitarianism implemented in practice, and thank God it's not, would actually make people worse off. And the conclusion is then that utilitarianism undermines itself, right? That's a pretty bad argument, because the response is, well, you're not arguing against utilitarianism. You're arguing there against a kind of naive first working out of what utilitarianism might say. And what you've showed is that actually it doesn't say that, right? You kind of just revise the recommendations which you think it makes. And then in the case of long-termism, if the argument is something similar, which is, look, long-termism says that the best actions are those actions, at least in a lot of contexts, which make the very long-run future go best. But those actions in practice would be really disastrous. Well, I think the most of that shows is that a naive version of long-termism is bad. And actually, that's still quite important, because maybe like we need to kind of keep revising what we think it implies in order to just avoid these like dangerous, naive first workings out. Does that make sense?
So let me reframe for long-termism just to make sure I understand. So the critique is something like, fine, if you assume that long-termism is going to tell us to only care about the future, and demonstrate that that's going to lead to bad consequences, and in the process, therefore, destroy our future potential, then that will demonstrate that we just need a more sophisticated version of long-termism, right? So that doesn't undermine long-termism per se. It just shows us that our initial conception of what it looks like to work on the long-term future is flawed. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I think one good thing to bring in at this point as well is right back in the intro, right? We were very like broad or like general in defining like what long-termism is. And it might be useful to bring in like some more specific definitions where the EA community is at the moment trying to work out, you know, what there is. And there's debates about like what long-termism implies. And I think so far we've generally, it feels like we've been talking about this form of like either patient long-termism, which says that there's no point doing anything today. You should invest your resources, gain interest, and then you'll have more to do in the future, where there's like a lot more value to be created. You also have this form of urgent long-termism, which relies on this idea that today is really special, and it means that we can lock things in today that will have an effect like many years into the future, whether that be 100 years or 1,000 years, I think is more dubious, but that's like that kind of way. And then within that, you've got like two other kind of schools of thought. You've got broad long-termism, which says that you're not really sure what anything does, like specifically, but you should just generally invest in institutional capacity or just like broader ways that you might help the future. And then you've got targeted long-termism, which is much more specific, where you take a particular S risk or a particular path change and you focus your efforts there. So all of those definitions is what I last read on the 80,000 hours website, but it might be like good to kind of distinguish as well as in what Finn was saying, that long-termism can mean a bunch of different things, and we're still trying to work out what that is. And some of those things just might be naive, and some of them, you know, might actually be getting at something useful.
It strikes me as decently analogous to arguments about what is true Christianity or what is true Marxism, where you get this like splintering effect. But in fact, Marxism and Christianity and long-term is just what Marxists and Christians and long-termists do. It's not a specific, like, we're just arguing about different slivers of something. But again, all that matters is how it makes people act in practice.
This goes back to what Vaden was saying about like in practice versus theory, right? Like, I think, Finn, your question assumes that there's some like theory of long-termism, some true essential theory of long-termism, and we are just lowly humans trying to interpret this like amazing mathematical / symbolic theory that we like have partial access to, and then we're exploring in what ways it should be correctly instantiated. But like, I just don't see the distinction.
No,
I see like people have ideas and they act on them, and we should be criticizing the ways in which it makes them act.
Well, the process is, so clearly it's not the case that some idea is handed down to us and we're in the business of trying to discover what that idea is, and we're kind of getting it wrong, and we're like archaeologists uncovering this kind of.
I kind of got that though from your conception of like, we have this naive implementation, and then based on the results we adjust so we can try and find the true conception of long-termism.
Yeah, maybe true is the wrong word. Maybe just best is another word.
Okay.
You can refine theories in other contexts, and it's like, there's no suggestion that you're uncovering something. But it is possible just to improve a theory. And maybe that's what we do.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's fine.
I think a more fruitful way to improve a theory would be to recognize that certain moves should be off the table. I will continue to repeat the multiplication of big numbers and small numbers and then making serious decisions on that. So let's just say whatever form of long-termism we're going to have is going to not do that. Because now we're talking about the consequence of certain moves. And contrast that against here is a taxonomy of 500 different variations of long-termism.
Yeah.
You have patient long-termism and slow patient long-termism, and then what's the true definition of and what's the best one? That seems to me to be a less fruitful way to improve the theory. Let's just focus on specific forms of argumentation, which we all recognize are ineffective at accomplishing our goals. And our goal in the broadest case is to make the world better for everyone. That's just the broadest goal that we all unite around. And so that I think is better than trying to say, well, that sounds like a naive implementation of long-termism, and so let's consider patient, strong, soft flavors of long-termism. I don't know, but there's like a thousand different definitions, and now we all have to memorize and understand the various definitions. And this is a waste of our time when we could just say, let's just not do this thing anymore, and let's not care about the different definitions. Let's just all agree we shouldn't do this thing.
Well, not if one of them turns out to be plausible. You said, in the example of Christianity, well, first of all, you said, look, we're only interested in how this thing works out in practice. And that obviously matters enormously. But there's also space to be interested in just what's true or what's the best version, even if it doesn't get implemented. And, the example of Christianity is, even if everyone or almost everyone who call themselves a Christian don't live up to like true Christian values, it would still be interesting to find out if some version of Christianity is true, even if no one lives up to that version. And especially in this case where, presumably people are interested in how to improve this thought before the wheels really start turning and the movement takes off as, they're kind of hoping it would. So it's useful to think about what the best theory is and to do that taxonomy in order to make that decision, right? It's not fixed.
But when we're talking about ethical theories that are true are those which improve the most amount of people's lives, right? Ethics is a unique case in this setting because we're not talking about theories of physics. We're talking about theories of how human beings relate to each other. And then the theory and practice are the same. Ethical theories are only as good as they improve the way that human beings relate to each other. At least when I say I'm interested in ethics, that's what I'm interested in, is improving the way that human beings relate. And if you say, well, ethics is actually about figuring out what the right discount factor is on the future well-being of people between now and the heat death of the universe, then that's not something that I think ethics is interesting from an ethical perspective, but I can't control obviously what the whole field is talking about. But I just think that this distinction between theory and practice is a silly one when we're talking about ethical theories.
I might be misunderstanding what you're saying there, but when you're talking about not being as interested in like the theory behind like the discount rate, I do see like how that has incredibly important like impacts in practice as well, though. Like for example, I mentioned this like thing in like government cost benefit analysis where you have like an explicit term for your like pure time preference, right? And that is something that philosophers have made like a case for being zero, but that isn't zero because of norms or other reasons like within economics that we can get into, but I think is like a bit of a tangent, right? But that is like a very clear avenue to me where like theory and being able to work these things out, maybe in a more abstract way, can really impact like real world decisions.
Yeah. So the idea here is that deciding which theory is best is just deciding which would be best in practice. And there shouldn't be daylight between those two things. I'm not sure we disagree.
Because you were making...
Yeah, I think there's just semantic differences happening here. I think everyone agrees.
Yeah, because I guess maybe I was misunderstanding that there is a claim that this could be true even if it leads to horrible consequences in practice. I'm saying that if it leads to horrible consequences in practice, then it's not true when it is ethical.
Yeah. I mean, we're all kind of like broadly consequentialists, so I think we agree there. There is,
but truth in this context refers to practice, and so we can't make this distinction. Is my point. People want to make the claim that sure, long-termism could kill everyone, but it could still be true, right? And it could still be the case that long-termism is true, even if it creates a huge amount of suffering.
No, I think maybe it's something like a naive version of long-termism can end up being incredibly harmful. But it doesn't follow that some version of long-termism could be true and therefore really good.
Like, I think maybe to give like an example, if we take naive long-termism to mean that all the money that we were going to donate to malaria nets or deworming, we're now just going to put into a bank account and we're going to wait for interest to accrue. And then at some point we'll spend it. And we can imagine, right, where that leads to just a really bad scenario where you never end up spending it. It's just a massive drain on resources and the world becomes a worse place. And that would be like a naive example of long-termism, which we might fall into, right? I'm not saying that's the case. The argument for patient long-termism is much more nuanced, but we'll just take that as like a naive kind of example. We could also imagine a more sophisticated version, which I suspect Vaden and Ben, you might be more sympathetic to, which is this case that, okay, we want to improve the long-term future and save this astronomic value. And we do that by investing in education, investing in malaria nets and the like, because that is our best route to that future, which I don't think you disagree with. You just then say, okay, well, then it's obvious. What's the point in doing all of this? And I think that leads on to like another disagreement we might have, where I don't think that's like the most obvious case. And there is like interesting things long-termism can bring in. But I think that might help distinguish between like a naive interpretation of long-termism and maybe a more like, reflected one.
I think again, this is mostly just semantic differences. I think if you just replace interpretation of long-termism with just calling it a separate theory, then I completely agree with you. Like, well, I'm just concerned about like the actionable elements of the theory. So if you call theory A the theory where you're using expected value calculus to say that the amount of potential future or amount of happiness in the future is like infinite, and this causes you to act in a certain way, I'm criticizing that. And then theory B is the one where you adopt that, but then you argue for like patient philanthropy or whatever, then I'll criticize that in a different way. And so we can call these just like different interpretations of the same theory, or we can just call these like theory A, theory B, theory C, whatever. And then I'll just like criticize each theory in turn, right?
And you don't even have to criticize the entire theory. Like when I'm critical of long-termism, like I can grant almost everything up and like to the expanding cone. That's fine. Let's say all of that is true. I frankly don't really care too much about that. I just care how it makes people act in practice. And so let me just grant all of that. And so the thing that I claim is making people act poorly in practice is this one rhetorical move. And let's just excise that. And then we can continue on our way talking about the 50 different variations of long-termism, and I'll be happy and everyone will be happy, because the concern about it making the world worse for people who are alive right now will be gone, or at least a predominant source of, I think, suffering will be removed from most of these variations of long-termism, because the suffering of people alive right here, right now, today won't be swallowed by this comparison to an infinite amount of people in the future.
Yeah, I mean, presumably no one wants to believe in a version of long-termism which they also expect to have terrible consequences. So what you're saying is just like definitely true.
But same with all utopian philosophies, right?
Yeah.
Like no utopian philosophy wants to have a philosophy that's going to have terrible long-term or short-term consequences. No one is in favor of that.
It's just an inevitable byproduct.
It's an inevitable byproduct of this kind of moral calculus.
Yeah. I mean, I take it the problem isn't so much caring about your actions having really great consequences in the long run, which is something that totalitarian ideologies have in common. The problem is being wrong about which actions do that. But one thing I wanted to mention, which you can get your teeth into, is we were thinking about examples of like naive workings out of long-termism, which could potentially be harmful. And it occurs to me that maybe one example is this kind of camp of like degrowth, environmentalist types. And the idea there is, look, what we're doing right now, all kinds of resource extraction and other practices is like totally unsustainable. You just kind of draw out the line. And so what do? We've got to like massively downscale everything we're doing, maybe revert back to more natural modes of life, tighten our belts, and in general just like slow down what gets called progress, but is really a kind of acceleration towards like Mad Max hellscape. That seems kind of instructively mistaken, and it feels like lots of people call themselves long-termists and then also buy into that kind of handful of views. So yeah, I mean, curious what you think about that, but I'm skeptical.
Just really quickly, which is like worth just explicitly pointing out how different that vision is from like the Nick Bostrom stuff. Ben and Vaden, you were like, I think mostly criticizing, which is this like infinite value kind of we colonize space and like the whole universe, right? This is like a very different interpretation that you can reasonably also like call yourself, I guess, like long-termist from, right?
Although just to be explicit, like, man, I've forgotten his surname, Roman Krasanik, I think he wrote this book, The Good Ancestor, which I think is actually overall like really great. And, it's like very explicitly a kind of sustained defense of long-termism. But he, on one hand, he does kind of mentions just how big the future could be as a motivation for caring about doing things now to make it better. And then he kind of makes this move and says, well, therefore we should just like do all this kind of slowing down degrowth stuff.
I was just going to say I'm basically equally as critical of all the degrowth stuff as like the infinite value of colonizing space stuff. I'm just curious, the last comment about Roman, I forget his last name. How does he get from like valuing tons of future people to degrowth environmentalism? Because my take on like the degrowth stuff is sort of it's this like ideology that humans are sort of like naturally bad for the environment, and we should only take up like a certain amount of space, and we're ruining this glorious Earth that without us would be flourishing. And we don't actually want that many people in the future because humans, what's so special about us? We're not so good. We're just like another animal. And so I'm very curious how he squares. I'm like equally as critical of both these views, but I'm very curious how he sort of squares both of them.
Yeah, so I think the thought is that more or less the number of people we should expect to live in the future is pretty much fixed. As good or bad as that number is. And the number in particular, I think he was thinking along the lines of how long has the Earth got left before, it's scorched by the sun. Let's just expect a kind of roughly similar number of people to live century on century until that kind of time scale, and you get a number from that. Holding that fixed, how do we make that go better? Well, I think
I see.
There's a flavor of technological skepticism where he raises the Bostrom stuff and the escaping Earth stuff and transhumanism stuff, and he thinks that's nice, but feels a bit sci-fi for me.
Yeah.
So we have a choice between continuing to do what we do, or we kind of start shifting away and scaling down, and then we kind of spread out our resources like more equitably or something.
I haven't read Rowan's book, so I don't know if this is like the way he kind of thinks about it. But like, to go back to Finn's cone, right? I think one way you can think about it is that if you try to expand the cone too much, it just collapses, right? So instead what you focus on is just like making the cylinder as long as possible. And that is like kind of where the value comes from.
I was going to say that I think both camps are basically doing the same thing, which is worrying about the long-term future and thinking the best way to preserve it is to stop doing everything that's got us this far. Stop improving technology, or stop working on short-term problems, which by solving we can make it a little bit better for the next generation. There's this idea that all the progress which has come before us is about to end, and the best way to preserve the long term is to change radically what we've done up until this point. And so the long-termist, short-termist thing is one flavor of this, but just the environmentalist and anti-technology thing that comes around all of the time. And like environmentalism to this extent is so funny, because if you hate half of the human race, you're a bad person for being a misogynist. If you hate like a particular race, you're a bad person for being a racist. But if you hate every human being on the planet, then you're an environmentalist. And I don't understand this anti-human being tendency that you get from the extreme environmentalists.
You're a certain kind of environmentalist.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, generalizing for rhetorical purposes, but it's a strain of environmentalism which basically views human beings as a pestilence, a plague, and wants to eradicate it.
And I think it's a crucial insight, I think, that what's driving both of these camps is the same thing. I think that same thing is like utopian thinking. Mm-hmm. So I think the long-termist is convinced that the long-term future can go exceedingly well. Just what we need to do now is just ignore like a little bit of the suffering that's going on in the world. Make sure AGI happens. Mm-hmm. Once we have AGI, we can simulate consciousness and make sure everyone's happy for billions and billions of years. That'll be great. And we'll enter this long reflection period, which is cited a lot actually in EA, is taken pretty seriously. We'll enter this long reflection where we'll have developed all the technology necessary to meet our needs, make us happy. Problems will have stopped, and we'll just think for thousands of years about exactly how we want the world to look. So we'll enter this non-problematic period. And then I think the environmentalist, or the radical environmentalist, thinks along similar lines, okay, we seem to right now there's continual problems, right? We keep developing technology faster and faster. We keep running into problems. We barely avert disaster every year. If we could just scale things back and just all be happy with a certain finite number of resources, realize that we can be happy like that, stop having kids, or stop having so many kids, and just enter the state of equilibrium, all will be well. We can all sort of live off the land, etc. And what these, at core, what both of these philosophies miss is that problems are inevitable, right? So problems are just a product of the fact that we can't foresee all the consequences of our actions. Even if we run expected value calculations. And because we can't foresee the consequences, but we're always trying to make things better, we're trying to solve problems, that means there will always be problems. And if we entered a state where there were no problems to solve, that would be really bad. It would imply there's nowhere left to go. It would be like a state of death, basically. Mm-hmm. Problems just arise because of conflicting ideas, right? Conflicting ideas about how to live better, how to make things slightly better, moral ideas. All these are just problems to be solved, and having problems is a good thing, right? It means we're making progress. We're moving forward.
I just want to highlight one tiny little thing, which is that I think in your beautiful comments, you actually gave a proof by contradiction that this is impossible. Because if we had got to a place where there were no more problems, that would be bad. That would be itself a problem. And so it's a logical contradiction that it's an impossibility, right? And so just completely wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. And I think that there actually contains in that more than just a strong argument, but actually a refutation of this idea.
I feel tempted to pour cold water on some of this because it feels possible to get ahead of ourselves and start worrying about something which no one believes.
Maybe I'm the utopian.
Fuck. Right. And if it wasn't for you meddling kid.
We'd all have our consciousness uploaded.
Exactly. Yeah, it sounds like you are worried. The kind of transhumanist utopian camp of Bostrom and his acolytes, or just stronger long-termists, if they got their way, they would recommend only focusing on those actions which we can be confident pay out over the very long run, and shutting down this kind of short-term problem solving and technological progress. And that's just kind of obviously not the case. One of the things these people care about the most is technological progress in particular. And there's a point to be made here, which is, I think long-termism, or at least the kind of most interesting form of long-termism, is a marginal claim. It's pointing out that this thing is currently way neglected, at least seems to be. And so there is an awful lot of potential, given that it's currently neglected. Now, if they got their way and more people cared about it, then it would become less neglected and less important as a consequence. But it would never reach a point where it's significantly eating in to short-term problem solving. And if it does, then I think I'm absolutely on team Ben and Vaden, where we should just be like very worried because this is just like missing an absolutely crucial fact about pretty much all human progress up to this point, which is that it's just been like solving a problem, not anticipating the next problem that comes along, and then like playing whack-a-mole with all the subsequent problems.
Can we all just look at the 80,000 hours problem profiles website together? Because this is already happening. Like, I don't even know how you could possibly say that it's not happening. Like,
so here's a question, right? So why is, for instance, working on climate change feels important? Because climate change itself is an enormously important problem. But there are other things that matter other than the absolute importance of an issue. You might also care that the issue is neglected, that is, not many people care about it and not many resources are currently spent on it. And you would also care about how solvable the issue is, like how tractable it is. And one of the reasons maybe that 80,000 hours currently thinks that these kind of weird long-termist cause areas are so important isn't because the problems themselves are absolutely more important than the kind of like pressing problems that the world faces right now. Maybe it's also because just as a matter of fact, it looks like very few people are working on them relative to how important they are. And also they kind of seem solvable. And that's why it's a marginal claim, because you can imagine a point in the future where the kind of talent gap gets filled and the kind of more obvious problems get solved. And now it's on like a more level footing with other things. That's the sympathetic case. And then just like, I'll say it for the 15th time, like I'm not claiming that's what I think. Like I basically don't know what to think right now. But you can imagine that's the pushback.
Here's my analogy, and forgive the cheekiness, but I think this gets the point across. So, there's a bunch of scientists thinking about evolution, thinking about how old the world is, trying to work out the hard problems of geology and plate tectonics and wrestling with how the climate affects how the earth evolves over time, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's like some religious fanatics who are like, well, no one's really focusing on the problem of like, what if the world is just 6,000 years old and it was created by an almighty God? That's a marginal claim, right? It's very neglected. It could have huge impacts if it was correct. And so we should have a portion of like the scientific community thinking about this question, right? It's not about like the content of the theory. It's just like, what if it was correct? We should expand our portfolio to like cover this case. And obviously, in that case, it's the reasons for believing that are bad, and I just think it's similar to the long-termist case, right? Like, we shouldn't be favoring AGI over climate change because in my opinion, the reasons for focusing on something like AGI are just bad reasons. So I'm just criticizing those regions. I'm not criticizing that, like, however much percent of anyone's altruistic portfolio is dedicated to the problem of long-termism. I don't care. I'm just whatever percentage they're dedicated to long-termism, that's what I'm criticizing. Finn does not look impressed.
I just have a weird resting expression. Okay, I mean, I'll just agree. Like, where the reasons are bad, then don't do the thing that the reasons point towards. I was just trying to clear up a like potential misunderstanding between what's just best at the margin because something's neglected and which issues are more important than other issues. And, where you mix those things up, then things are going wrong. But I think we're on the same page, and it just comes down to like a more straightforward object level potential disagreement about which like reasons are best.
You're talking as if we don't have just a really great list in front of us that shows exactly how people prioritize all the problems on the 80,000 hours website. And so please, listeners, go to 80,000hours.org/problem-profiles, and you will see first that climate change is already slipping down the list. So on the point of climate change, just give it time. It'll be off there soon. But above things,
by induction.
Yeah, above things like mental health and biomedical research are such solvable problems as aging and global governance in outer space and how to do whole brain emulation, which means literally download your brain into a computer like Black Mirror, and S risks. These are interesting things to talk about and discuss, but my God, these are not even in the same camp as dealing with suffering and poverty in developing countries right now. And the slip is already happening. It's like, it's not hypothetical. We don't have to think like, what is might going to happen in the future, just look at the website and see what I'm referring to, what we're referring to. I just want to highlight that because it's not a hypothetical point.
I am worried, or have like an intuition that there is a problem in not addressing these short-term things more, because you're not going to be in a position to address these long-term causes before you've solved a lot of the stuff. So we kind of talked about the example of climate change, right? Where I'll be like very upfront as well, is like personally something I care, I think, much more than the average EA. So my judgment might be clouded there, but I don't see a world where even if we avoid the like really extreme risks of climate change, right, and we still have a future, that we're going to be like in any capacity to solve things like AI or existential risks or what have you. And I think that is a point, actually, I think you were getting at, right, where you kind of have to solve problems almost as they kind of come along. And a lot of the other work feels much more speculative. So I agree with you completely there. I would just say that the way I kind of reached to that conclusion is still from some way of like long-termism, where it's still the future I care about. But I agree that's probably more semantics than like a fundamental disagreement.
Did you care about climate change before long-termism?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably my bias, right?
But it also indicates that long-termism didn't get you there, right?
No, okay, no, that's fair. But I would say that, like, I think I feel within like my EA journey, like in quotes, right? I was much more focused on RCTs and the randomista stuff, and long-termism for me was a way to look at solutions which I had like previously discarded, or like cause priorities that I hadn't thought could be justified within the EA framework. And that is where I see like a lot of value within. That might be like a very niche thing that just happens to speak to me, and I hope like a few other people. But I understand that is kind of like from a very different place where you guys are kind of coming at it from.
I'll just jump on this wagon and just agree with everything you said, Luca. Yeah, so I'm also really worried about ways that long-termism could play out, especially in these scenarios where it becomes parasitic on these other just like obviously good cause areas, and a lot of attention gets funneled to these like massively speculative ideas which turn out to be badly misguided, and then the entire movement ends up stalling. But what do those kind of objections have in common? I think they're all like really practical worries. So like earlier on, we were talking about all the kind of slightly more philosophical, airy, methodological problems. And actually, I don't think you need to worry about that in order to worry about long-termism, or at least some of its potential recommendations. I think all the problems can get going in a much more down-to-earth sense, which is just thinking about what works in the real world. And so that's where I'm like most on board. I still think that there are like things which we can do which like plausibly stands to improve the very long run future, which long-termism draws out in a really unique way, in just the same way that effective altruism originally drew out the importance of certain kinds of effective charities, even though those charities existed before. So I think there's like a space for some kind of, synthesis or agreement. But these practical problems, the way in which you resolve those problems seems most straightforward. It doesn't involve like doing lots of complicated philosophy. So there's this kind of, it gets called the like epistemic objection to long-termism, which is, look, I buy into these ethical claims about the far future mattering just as much as the near future. We don't want a pure discount rate. Future people matter as much as present people. But you also need to find the things we can do now, again, which stands to reliably improve how the long-run future goes. And maybe it's just the case that there are no such things. Or if there are, we can't find them because we're not, like, omniscient. And in that case, as, like, super clever and robust as the kind of ethical, philosophical part of the argument is, there's nothing in the actual world to fill it out. So there's nothing we can do about it. That seems like the most plausible criticism of long-termism in general. Few things to say there, though. and I can imagine this being the kind of pushback from the long-termist. One is, well, if we don't know now, then let's not just give up. Let's fund and throw our time and effort into doing research, right? So we take a step back, and the new problem is like finding the object level problems to go out and solve, which like makes some sense. And the other thing is that I'm pretty confident that there like are at least some things that we can do which stand to reliably influence the long run future. And probably those things have to do with existential risks, especially in cases where we're falling so short. I think I've mentioned it like 15 times already, but biological weapons, for instance, and nuclear weapons, and risk from AI. Those things actually seem quite concrete and solvable now. So there are some examples, and the question is how many of those examples there are.
I agree with everything except the risk from AI. I mean, the other ones are like problems that we know exist, and of course we should.
You'll be the first to be enslaved.
Yeah, I already am enslaved. It's too late.
Yeah, right.
I put a good word in building the overlords as we speak.
Because Vaden's an expert in AI, so his credence matters, right? We have to take that into account. And his credence is 100% that AI.
Exactly. Yeah, I wish it would be so much easier if I was allowed to just use that move. Like, you're talking to an expert, but obviously that's bullshit. Like, I'm just a person who has biases like anybody else. But from an outsider perspective, you could describe me as a quote expert, which I just cringe every time I say that word. But I'm in a top research lab studying artificial intelligence with people who are the ones that people think about when they talk about AI.
Yeah,
and like, I'm just a human being, right? And I would never dream of talking in this way, that you should believe my beliefs over somebody else's beliefs. Even if I was asked via survey from Toby and Nick Bostrom, I would still like not think this is a valid way to argue. And it seems like the whole AI risk and AI alignment conversation is entirely propped up from arguments of basically that form, that a lot of experts are worried, and therefore we should be worried too. And in general, I think thinking about AI safety is okay. It's one of many important things to think about. It's just not something which should be funneling money away from poor people. Is it Anders Sandberg? What's the guy's name?
He gave a talk about Popper.
Yes, exactly. So that's the one I was referring to. He did a beautiful analysis of the poverty of resourcism. It was excellent, and he addresses the importance of having a feedback mechanism in the talk. He this is the only way we can actually get traction when it comes to evaluating our theories. And it's super interesting, like when you really digest a lot of Popper's thinking, because you can see how there are domains well outside of academia that are thriving because they have this feedback mechanism that you wouldn't typically think of. So, for example, stand-up comedy is an interesting example, because you can try
Nick Bostrom was a stand-up comic, and he said that his favorite part of doing it was the feedback, because you immediately know whether you've made a bad joke or a good joke.
Yeah, and so there is development there. Same with jiu-jitsu, so BJJ, like Brazilian jiu-jitsu. A friend of mine teaches it, and just the way that he was talking about his teaching strategies was completely Popperian. He didn't know about Popper and stuff, but it was like, I want my students to have certain realizations, and they'll try things, and they'll be then falsified by being dropped onto the mat and stuff.
I mean, Popper didn't invent trial and error, in fairness.
It's not that he invented trial and error, it's just he recognized its deep philosophical significance compared to other methods which are proposed. But anyway, like, the point is, Sandberg recognized the importance of this feedback mechanism, and we don't have this. We can't have this dealing with the long-term future. And this is why I think all research along these lines is ultimately going to come up with nothing, because all we really have to get traction are arguments and stuff. But
all or most.
Let me say most. Like, until we can start getting traction through a feedback mechanism, we're just writing science fiction. And science fiction is interesting for idea generation and stuff, and you can generate good ideas, but you only can evaluate which ideas are good and poor by some feedback mechanism. And unless we have that injected into the system.
And importantly, even if some are right, you won't know it.
Exactly.
Right. That's the issue. It's not that you're coming up with like necessarily wrong ideas. It's that you can't differentiate the right ones from the wrong ones or the better ones from the worse ones. And so that's the issue. It's not like, obviously we can't say everything coming out of the community is wrong. It's just that we have no fucking idea which one. We can't falsify any of it. Like,
and also like, it isn't just some low risk thing that you're rolling dice. It again is, pitting the well-being of people alive today against the well-being of an infinite number of people in the future. So it's every dice roll is a way to forget about a current problem through one more bullet on the 80,000 hours problem profile website.
Yeah.
It's like, here's another dice roll. Here's one reason why we can't have both S risks and climate change, but let's just make climate change go down one more notch. Let's roll the dice again, and now we have John Hamm, and roll the dice again, and every single time it just goes down further and further and further until it's forgotten about.
I think that's really interesting. I think like it's getting me to think about this important distinction, which admittedly I hadn't really made, I think, before this conversation, which is that there's two very different like conclusions from long-termism. Oh, I guess like two different ways you can use it. And I think I'm finding myself like more and more on one side of it. So I guess like on the one hand, we talked about this like long-termism, taking these bets and mostly focus around these S risks, which can often seem sci-fi, which I like Finn. I think X risks are like something that is like worth considering, and I think we're paying too little attention to, but I definitely see the danger from that. I think the other point where I might be like falling more, or like where I'd be more comfortable getting behind, is this thing of using like almost in a political economy sense, like these future generations just to like be able to make decisions where I just think we are like very short term at the moment, and making that moral argument might be enough to like sway a decision. And I don't think, I mean, I'd be interested to hear if like any of you like disagree with that, like as a statement.
I didn't track the statement, or at least perhaps Ben, did you? I think I misunderstood what the actual second part was.
Yeah, so let me rephrase. So I think like an example to maybe give is that like, let's say we take something like climate change, right? And we run a cost benefit analysis, and we find out that like we should be limiting it to 2.5 degrees, but you know, the extra effort it's going to take to like 2 or 1.5 degrees is not worth the costs. Then you could like make the like argument that, okay, but like it's not just us, right, who are going to live in this world, it's all these future generations. And because it's such a huge amount, right, you then have the moral argument to say, okay, we're going to go down and keep it below 1.5 degrees. And I definitely understand the concern that I think you rightfully raise, is that this can be a really slippery slope, where then all of a sudden you're doing these really horrible things in the name for this like utopian future. But that is still where I see a lot of value in long-termism, just where you look at like human nature, or you look at society as a whole, we are like incredibly impatient, and that causes a lot of problems. And thinking about this, and I think reflecting on this, even if it's not in this like expected value kind of sense, I think is really, really worthwhile. And I do think has important conclusions for like effective altruism when you think about what the most effective things are to do in the future. And I think that just means being a bit more paranoid about like nuclear war or biological risks and the like, and climate change as well, right, for me. But I think like that's where I see the value, the practical value, right, of long-termism, is in being able to make that moral case.
I guess one interesting thing to mention here is just our success, our record of success in dealing with previous other things that would have been described as existential risks. For example, ozone layer, acid rain, overpopulation, lack of fertilizer that caused like wars in the end of the 1800s and stuff. And human beings are incredibly good at solving problems which at the particular time in history seemed insurmountable, right? Seemed like there was absolutely no way we were going to overcome this. And before climate change, it was called global warming. And before that, there's global cooling.
Developing a vaccine in a year.
Getting colder. Yeah. Developing a vaccine in a year. And so human beings are like really great at solving seemingly insurmountable existential risks. And I just want to emphasize that, because it seems like a background assumption is that, like, if it wasn't for long-termism, we would not care about the long-term future, and we wouldn't be able to proceed, when really I think much of history can be viewed from the lens of preserving the long term. Like, what do you think the fight against fascism was all about in World War II, if not like ensuring the long-term future of the species? So this is a long-termist cause. It's not described that way.
Point taken. I think the thing where, and I might be wrong here, but like the thing where I'm kind of, I think, getting at is that it's not like an either or thing. You're right that we maybe avoided like the worst consequences, right, of these things. And, you know, in all likelihood, we'll survive the worst consequences of climate change as well. But there is still, right, like a meaningful difference as if you just barely make it, or if you do it with like room to spare and millions of lives saved, right? I think that's like where I'm getting at, where like that thing might seem marginal, and like maybe long-termism only really makes a marginal difference, but that can still mean saving like 1 million lives for something that just is worthwhile, right? And like I think that's kind of where it gets at. But I agree, like the disagreement fundamentally there is small, and I'm also like super optimistic, right, about like value and like value creation and knowledge and all the like, and I definitely think we have that in us. And
this might be out of place, but one of the nice analogies that Will McCaskill came out with is to picture our trajectory as a cruise ship setting off from like the UK to New York, for instance. And he said, look, imagine you jump out and you start swimming and you start pushing against one side to change its course. You know, in the next half hour or hour, no one will notice the difference in trajectory it's making. But if you keep swimming, if you keep it up until it arrives at the States, it'll arrive in like Florida or something rather than New York. And maybe that's the point Luke is making about it's not so much an either or, it's just that when we're talking about trajectory changes rather than these kind of step changes like existential risk, it's nice to think about those metaphors as kind of, making these things more salient. Since I'm rambling, I want to say that like I feel like we're kind of rounding things up. At least I ran out of things to say about 2 hours ago. But I'll just like say kind of where I am. So I think I'm kind of like normatively and morally uncertain, just like probably you should be and most people are. But it feels like the most important and plausible objections to long-termism are the practical and epistemic ones that you and others raise. In other words, can we actually find anything that we can do right now to make the long-run future go better, at least beyond existential risk? And then once we've found those things, can we put them in practice without trampling on the feet of these other cause areas, which also matter? And can we implement these kind of long-termist trajectory changes without some kind of dangerous, like ideological slide where we are justifying like all manner of present sacrifices and harms in the name of, and like in a way in which just things turn out really badly? And where that ends me up is like Luca, I think, very sympathetic to a kind of watered down long-termism, and then like very interested in a stronger version of long-termism, kind of curious to learn more. And I don't think I actually said this at the start, but yeah, that's kind of where I am.
Yeah, so I'll just give my little closing thoughts, which is everything you said basically sounds like a win from my perspective, because my goal is not to get everyone to abandon using the phrase long-termism. It's just to recognize that the pursuit of this one idea has the potential, if not has already started, hurting a lot of people by just reallocating all of the focus and attention away from pressing current problems right now. And it's done via this one move, which I'm going to continue to repeat until the cows come home, which is multiplying small numbers and big numbers and associating that with some crazy sci-fi scenario, and then using this as some sort of morally significant argument. And if these components can be taken away from long-termism, then I'm completely in favor of long-termism. It's just those things that are quite worrying. And lastly, I think that the subject of ethics and morality is one that every human being who has interacted with another human being and has to figure out how to treat people kindly has a voice in, and not one person is not or more or less capable of talking about this stuff than any other person. So, yeah, that's my comment.
One thing I wanted to add is there's like a great EA forum post by Gregory Lewis about called like Beware Surprising and Suspicious Convergence, which I think just relates to a bit about what we talked. Basically, like the thing is that generally we might expect two things to be correlated, but not really at the very top. So as an example to give to listeners, we would expect that somebody who's very good at tennis would also be good at basketball because they're both generally fit, and you imagine that there is some correlation. But right at the very top, you no longer suspect that correlation to hold, and it might even be negative, right? And I think the way that I kind of see that relating to our debate about long-termism and some of the questions about what it actually means in practice is that I think in general, acting in the favor of the short term is also good for the long term, which is why I don't think personally I'm too concerned about these more like authoritarian slips and stuff. I think generally, I mean, it's to be proven is just my intuition, but generally I think that will be the case. But when you're really optimizing, I do think long-termism promises to reach some counterintuitive things that we might not have thought about before, or maybe correct some failures that I see in the market or in government at the moment. And that's like the valuism where I see long-termism. But I think this discussion has really helped me hone in maybe on those aspects more than the expected value things, which I definitely see.
Yeah, I'm certainly not arguing against using future generations as an argument in the political sphere. So if you're arguing, for example, about like climate change and what the carbon tax should be, I'm all in favor of saying we should take future generations into account, right? We should think of like the possible devastation we're enacting on the world and use that to just like argue about the trade-offs between various policies and how intense we want to be about shutting down certain industries, for example. But what I'm not in favor of is like pretending that we have knowledge about future events and how certain actions now are going to influence the future, and even trying to get at that information via math, and trying to conjure information sort of out of thin air, even though no one would claim we're trying to do that. But I think by just doing the math and then writing these numbers down, it conveys a certain sense of certainty that we just like don't have when it comes to that. I can see Finn wants to rebut my point.
No, not at all. I was just thinking of a way to sum up your worries. And, one thing maybe worth saying is that it seems to me that the parts of long-termism which you're worried about actually have little to do, at least intrinsically, with either the future or the fact that future is long. It's to do with all the paraphernalia that gets associated with it and the ways, the frameworks for reasoning which go along for the ride, and the kind of formal methods which people buy into too much and so on. So there's nothing wrong with caring about the long run future.
No, of course, yeah.
You just care about the kind of ways of reasoning about it.
And how those reasons are used to swamp every other consideration.
Sure.
Right? Yeah.
Sure.
The final point I'll make, which is very unfair of me to bring up 4 hours and 25 minutes into this conversation, which I'm realizing we didn't touch on, which is a bit of a shame, but either we can talk again or I can just have the final word on it because I'm right and have authority, is a common rebuttal I'll hear to to people arguing against long-termism is like, look, every action we take has long-run consequences. And so you have to care about the long-term future no matter what, right? Like, even by distributing bed nets in Africa, those are going to have super long-run consequences. So either you have to start doing expected value calculations and think really hard about what the long-run future entails, because any action you take has significant influence on it. And so by not dealing with that question, you're just like a priori assuming that your favorite short-term action has beneficial long-term consequences. But what this misses is the option of refusing to answer questions that we can have no way of answering. So instead of trying to right now optimize exactly how we want the future to go, it's to recognize that every action that we take is going to have consequences that are going to lead to future problems. And the best thing we can do is set up a societal infrastructure and have as many people ready to tackle those problems as they inevitably arise. So right now we have reason to believe that like distributing bed nets is an incredibly good thing and can save people's lives. And then of course this is going to have certain consequences that we can't foresee, right? This is going to speed up economic development of certain countries, which perhaps leads to more greenhouse gases or more factory farming or something that we can't imagine, right? There's going to be ideas and political institutions that arise out of these countries. But instead of trying to guess at what those are right now, we could just recognize that we will tackle those problems as they arise. And, we could just call this problem cluelessness and then freak out about how we can't predict the long run future, or we can just of course recognize that yes, predicting the long term future is impossible, and the way we generate knowledge is by solving current problems, recognizing those problems will yield inevitably to future problems, and then solving those when they arise. And this is good. This is how we make progress and generate knowledge. And so the best thing we can do is like have institutions and mentalities in terms of like error correction that are ready to solve those problems as they arise. So I just wanted to highlight that there is a third option here, and it's not to just ignore the future or try and optimize it right away. It's just to recognize there will be problems, and we'll solve those as they come.
Anyone object to letting Ben have the last word?
I think the war of attrition, 4.5 hours has worked. I think I'll just throw in the towel.
Intense,
Fine, whatever.
Problems, inevitability, error correction.
I don't care. I don't care anymore. We are actually now living in a very long run future.
Yeah. Well, that was so much fun, gentlemen. I hope to do